Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Adult Onset Horsemanship. I'm your host, Daniel Dauphin.
I'm very pleased to be joined today by one of the world's leading experts on equine gastric ulcer syndrome, or EGUS. Dr. Benjamoin Sykes attained his Bachelor of Veterinary Medicine and Surgery in Australia. He has since traveled to the US to learn and teach, and then to Finland to learn and teach, somehow earning a PhD in the process. So he's a double doctor, I guess. Dr. Sykes was the lead author of the European College of Equine Internal Medicine Concensus statement on equine gastric ulcer syndrome in adult horses. He's published more research than I can count and is listed by Stanford University as one of the top 1% of researchers in all of scientific research, not just veterinary medicine. He's also funny and engaging, so enjoy this one. Well, Dr. Sykes, I'm thrilled to have you joining me today. I know this is an episode a lot of people anticipate, as ulcers are just a plague on the equine world at this particular time. So even though we're going to get into a heavy conversation later, we're still going to start off with the icebreaker questions. I will tell you, if I haven't told you already, these are for points and prizes. So you want to be on your A game here, okay?
Just a little bit competitive, so that's fine.
If you were a Jedi, what percent chance is there that you would misuse the Force?
About 10, I reckon. I think it's. I think the world's better when we push the boundaries a little bit. I mean, I think there are rules and frameworks, but I think the world's better. I think, as a research scientist and stuff like that, I've probably made my career on the edges, asking questions that maybe are uncomfortable. And so, yeah, maybe 10. Some might say 20%.
I like that. Depends on if it's a Monday or a Friday, right?
Yeah, Monday or Friday, and depends which buttons are pressed in the conversation, and kind of how much motivation there is to sort of challenge the status quo. Or challenge a lot of the paradigms and that. But I probably in my career probably thought of as a little bit of as a troublemaker, maybe in terms of challenging some of the things that we hold as doctrine, and then from a research methodology taking that on. So I think it's important that we push the limits a little bit.
I agree completely. There's no dragons to fight, so dogma will have to do, right?
Yeah, the greater the ignorance, the greater the dogma, the greater the ignorance, and it's really remarkable. It's amazing in veterinary medicine how many things we're really dogmatic about, that when you actually peel back and you go back to see where they came from, they appeared out of nowhere. And they either appeared because it was the best understanding of what we had back in typically the 80s and 90s formed a lot of these dogmas, or in the ulcer world, when you actually trace them back, a lot of them were generated by marketing departments. And actually marketing departments have created an awful lot of the dogmas that we hold really true. And when we challenge them scientifically, they don't hold.
I am foaming at the mouth to have that conversation with you. Morning or evening?
Oh, definitely morning. I'm useless by about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'm an early starter. I've got three teenage kids, and it's really interesting. Two of them get up about between 5 and 6, which is when I get up, sort of 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. We get started, and two of them, the 13-year-old and 17-year-old, wander out about the same time, and everyone pokes around, does their own thing, and then starts engaging. And then the 15-year-old in the middle is the complete opposite. She's the night owl, and she drags herself out of bed every morning just enough to get the job done before she heads off to school. To be fair, they get up and feed a bunch of horses. They feed 20 odd horses before they go to school. So it's still a morning job. But yeah, definitely mornings. Afternoons is much more wandering around, creative space, finding farm work to do and stuff like that.
Years ago, I took to playing Sudoku on my phone to go to sleep at night, and I will play until I get stuck. And without fail, what I will get stuck on in the nighttime, I will easily solve the next morning right away. Like it is, even though I may feel as sharp as can be, objectively, I absolutely know my brain does not work as well in the evenings. And I don't know about you. My wife's a night owl, so that's a constant source of irritation between us.
Yeah, very similar scenario. My wife and middle daughter are like two peas in a pod. They are just mirror images of each other in so many ways. And then the son's a mirror image of me, and then the youngest one's sort of in between. But the youngest one and I have a standing joke that the 13-year-old and I race each other to bed each night. It's like 8:30 and we're done. We're who's going first type thing. It's almost like a competition these days.
I like it. How long do you dunk a cookie in milk?
Oh, just a brief dunk. You don't want it to fall apart. So um, in Australia, we have these Tim Tams, which are like these chocolate coated biscuits. It's like a double wafer with a nougat in the middle and chocolate around the outside. And you're meant to bite off the two ends and suck coffee through it. That's sort of like the big Tim Tam thing. We try and keep them out of the house for weight control reasons, but yeah, cookie dunking's a very short process.
Do you have a standout horse memory?
I probably have a standout horse. I was playing PoloCross for a few years and riding different horses and ticking along, and then I went to a camp and with some guys who I've become good friends with. And at the end of the week, they said, "Look, we just need to find you. It's actually we need to find you a decent fucking horse. Like, stop riding these camels. We need to get you a proper horse." And so these two mates of mine, one of which broke horses in for a living for one of the top polocross breeders in Australia, lined up a bunch of horses and said, "This is the one, take this horse." And I'm like, "Oh, cool, can I ride it?" They're like, no, it's not ready for you yet. You'll get it back when it's ready. So another one of my mates took it out west and out to the edge of the outback for 2 years, trained it, rode it, installed all the buttons and gave this thing back to me. And his name was Dr. D. And he was a rocket ship. He was just the most amazing horse, but he was a kind, sweet gentleman on the ground. And then you got on him and it was like riding a Ferrari. And yeah, so he was that special horse. And then when I finished with him, my son rode him a little bit, and then my, at the time, 13-year-old daughter rode him. And this was a horse that could play A-grade polocross or come back and play with a 13, 14-year-old 80-pound kid on its back and do the job, and never once did a thing wrong. So yeah, he gave a lot of good memories, a lot of really good times, and he's really hard to replace that one.
Was he an Australian stock horse or like a thoroughbred or what?
Yeah, an Australian stock horse. So nearly all the polocross horses are Australian stock horses, and so they're basically like a light thoroughbred with a little bit more of the temperament, more like a quarter horse temperament, more cowy and sort of very fast learners, very street smart, very sensible, and typically very kind horses. But that athleticism more like a thoroughbred type body.
Very cool. Do you have a bucket list horse item?
A bucket list horse item. I mean, the funny thing is, I'm not really horsey. I didn't grow up as a horse person, and my entire world is horses. We have. I've got a wife who has ridden horses since she was 5 years old, and we do rehoming of thoroughbreds from Hong Kong. We have a string of eventing horses that the daughters ride, but it's not actually really probably. I mean, I know I ride occasionally these days. I not as much as I used to, but I don't really have, I guess, a horse bucket list. It's probably more back to that technical side of things. If someone, if I got $5 million, what would I do with it? It would be to continue ticking away doing what I do from that technical research side of things. It'd be really trying. It sounds a bit corny, but I was talking with my colleagues the other day, who's a big name in a big presence in the US market as well, and we were having this conversation that this is what we enjoy doing. So if we were given our sort of horse bucket list, it would be the capacity and resources to continue to pick away at particularly glandular gastric disease, because that interaction between working with the horses and solving a problem for the horses and solving a problem for the owners, I think is the thing that I would like to do. And I don't know, I've got another 10, 15 years maybe of my career, hopefully we can get some, some more progress on that. And so that if I can get to the end of that, I'll consider my bucket list done.
What would constitute the end? Is there a holy grail to the research, a stopping point, or realistically, no?
Realistically, no. But I think that there are some really clear, defined waypoints that we could sort of target for. So I think there are some waypoints that if we can cross those, we get to a level that we've got a deeper, richer understanding, and move us in that next big direction. And I think we've crossed those at various times. It's a game of increments. It's kind of like it's like American football, right? Or you guys just call it football. You might be making 1 or 2 yards at a time, then occasionally you get the big Hail Mary and you get a big win and you make a big step forward. But most of it's a yard or two at the time. But yeah, I think if we could understand diagnostics a lot better for glandular disease, I think there's a big hole there. Understanding a lot more about why the disease occurs, and then we're making steps forward, but then making some steps forward in, getting our success rates for glandular disease up towards where we have them for squamous disease. They would be the three things. We're not going to solve the problem, but I think we can define some pretty achievable benchmarks to get there.
Do you have a bucket list item that has nothing to do with horses?
The current on the list currently is to climb Mount Kilimanjaro in January next year. So
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So my midlife crisis is to take up. I can't do most of the sports I used to be able to do, but to take up hiking. So I'm hiking the Kokoda Trail, which is a World War II, very historically significant for Australian World War II trail in Papua New Guinea. Doing that in April. That's about 60 miles over 8 days through the jungle. And then planning on doing Mount Whitney in California in June. And then that's a build up towards doing Mount Kilimanjaro with my son just before his 18th birthday, as he goes into his final year of high school, to go and do Kilimanjaro in Tanzania in January next year. So that's the current bucket list. And then I guess we'll see where we go from there.
That's a pretty respectable bucket list item, I have to say. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we're going to test the altitude tolerance. We'll see how that goes. The hiking, I'm not too worried about. The altitude might be the challenge, but that's to be seen.
Do you have a favorite place to eat? And as a citizen of the world, not just a one country guy, that could be anywhere. So,
yeah, great question. It's certainly one of the great joys of my job is I get to travel a lot, and I get to be wined and dined often by companies with a generous checkbook, and a healthy credit card that we tend to go to nice restaurants. And I recently had 3 meals in a row in three days. I went from Finland to Denmark to Norway and got the taste of the local in each, and 3 exquisite meals. If I had to pick one place, it would probably be Italy. But I think there's so many good options around the world now, and even the US. There's so many places in the US that the standard is so high that you can find a good meal just about anywhere you go if you look for it these days. If it's a steak, it's the US. I live on a beef cattle farm. We grow our own beef, and really the only place in the world that I'll look to order a steak for something special is the US. I think you guys do that better than just about anyone else.
well, I'll take that for sure. Do y'all, just totally an aside question, but the Wagyu thing is becoming more and more of, like, they even have now what they consider an American Wagyu, where they're basically getting frozen semen from Japan and then putting it in Angus cattle, and it's kind of becoming its own breed. So since y'all are much closer to Japan, is that anything that's happening in Australia in the beef world at the moment? Or?
Yeah, Wagyus are a thing here. My dad's actually into Wagyus. He's for years he sort of stayed away, and then in the last it'd be 5-10 years, I can't remember. It was the benchmark for everything's pre and post COVID. I can't, that's like it's BC or AC. I think he's probably been into the Wagyus for about 10 years. And yeah, they're a big thing here. They command a market premium. And yeah, exactly that Wagyu Angus cross is a really big market. Where I live, it's tropical country, so it's almost the complete reverse where we have really lean meat, but it's really lean grass-fed tender meat that we tend to have here, versus that real marbling from the Wagyu. So where's the best steakhouse in your part of the world?
We're actually not very known for steaks here. I'm in South Louisiana, so this is more of a seafood area. I really don't know. Like there are good steaks here. There's a Ruth Chris's here in town, and I guess that would be most people's answer. I'm not real big on a $400 meal for two. That's just not a norm for me. So I would be more likely just to cook it at home. But seafood around here is really really high. We have an incredibly high standard for food in South Louisiana. Like you literally can get a meal at a gas station that's better than most restaurants in most places. So if a restaurant's not excellent, it will not stay open around here for very long at all. So, um, but not so much beef, more
Yeah,
seafood and that kind of thing.
yeah, nice.
What would you, and I'm kind of interested in this because you're coming at it from a veterinary perspective, but what would you say is the most important quality of a horseman?
I would say probably the most important quality, and I'm not a horseman. I say that as someone who works with horses, but I don't know that I consider necessarily myself as a horseman. I would say the most important quality of a horse is probably temperament, and I would say the same for the horseman or horse person.
Well, so I would say here, let me just probably pay you a compliment because I haven't actually seen you work a horse, but I've known a lot of veterinarians that don't really ride, but I would still consider them horsemen. They like you watch them handle a horse. A lot of times the horse is in pain or something. They're about to stick them with a needle, and they still know where to stand to not get pawed or kicked or that's all part of what I would call the puzzle of being a horseman. They still know their way around a horse and how to go about their job. I have been very surprised by some veterinarians that I knew that I knew didn't ride, but I could watch them handle a horse in pain and do things that I don't think I could have gotten away with having done to them. So I still think that counts myself anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely a different skill set. And you get a very small window to work with to work with individual horses, and you're often doing something that's unpleasant to the horse. So it's definitely a learnt skill. About it's a good percentage of the people I know that are horse vets, a little bit like me, didn't come from horsey backgrounds, and have had to learn how to do it. Um, and yeah, it's that you get this very narrow window to get the job done. And it's very outcome orientated, but it's obviously trying to do it in a way that's compliant with the horse and in the horse's best interest and in everyone's safety. You go back to the day we used to it was a lot more rough and tumble 25 years ago. Everyone would just barrel in and, it was almost like a game down the racetrack who could take on the biggest, meanest, nastiest horse and survive. I think we've moved ahead of that now. We're much more sort of receptive to what the horse's needs are in the engagement, not just to our job of our goal of getting the job done.
Bay or sorrel or any other particular color? Do you have a preference?
Oh, if I go out to the paddock, there's 19 bays and two chestnuts. We don't really have sorrels and very few paints in Australia. I did own a paint whose name was Monkey, and the name was very appropriate for the horse. He was a loose cannon. This thing could buck like anything. Didn't do it very often, but then just occasionally decided that he was going to go. And I would challenge most people to seat him when he bucked, because he was incredibly athletic. I just the good old fashioned bay gelding. My good horses, my two best horses are both being good old fashioned simple bay geldings, and honest and kind.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how well can you back a trailer?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. I'd give myself a 9. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, well, it's you're the get out of jail free card on the farm, right? So the moment someone gets into trouble, you've got to do it. But then, of course, I have a teenage son coming through, and there's just a little bit of competition there. So we have to make sure that the skills are kept sharp for him, so that he can't get on top just yet.
Got to continue to assert dominance. I understand. I have the same situation. Yeah.
Yeah, they're wild and hard to control, so you just got to have that subtle control constantly on them. There are things you can still do better.
Would you tell us something unexpected about you?
Probably that I don't come from a horsey background. I really I grew up on a beef cattle farm. I had nothing to do with horses until pretty much when I finished university. So my older sister always had ponies, but I never really had anything to do with them. And becoming a horse vet was almost an accident, or sort of an opportunity recognition, rather than something that this sort of deep passion that horses are the center of my existence. It's been very much a professional development, and then over time, as I've worked with them, and then obviously get more involved in the industry, I've become more and more engaged as a horse person, and in understanding and appreciative of working with them.
Well, for what it's worth, I think about to climb Mount Kilimanjaro is pretty high up there on the unexpected list, too.
Well, it's funny because yes and no, because if you look at vets, it's that kind of stuff is really common amongst vets. There's sort of, I don't know whether it's a control need thing or something, but if you look at vets, the number of classmates I know that all, it's sort of that midlife crisis thing, but even younger, but it's that run triathlons, do ultra marathons, like do the Ironman triathlons, do ultra marathons. I had a friend who was running 7 marathons in 7 days in the desert because he wanted to, like, just and it's, I think it's a personality type thing. We know vets have this sort of very particular type personality, and I think one of the manifestations of that is the sort of desire or drive to do these slightly sort of things on the edge, or push the boundaries a little bit.
Yeah, self-challenging. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Do you like to take side trips when you travel? So I don't know if that's the kind of thing that you're afforded the time, but if I go somewhere new, I try to add an extra day or two on the front end or the back end, where I do what I'm there to do professionally, and then I explore a little bit, or get to sightsee or whatever. So you ever get to do that?
I'm trying to get a lot better at it. Probably spent 10 years traveling a lot for work and just shuttling in and out of cities. And it's like, oh, I went to Nashville. It's like, yeah, but I just went to the convention center and I left, and I didn't actually go and experience Nashville. I went to Grand Ole Opry because it happened to be across the road. And so a lot of it's time, and there's always these time pressures, but I've got myself in a position now where I have that little bit of extra time, and so I do try as much as possible now to tack on something, so I can go and have a bit of a look-see around around the local area, or do something at least on the way back. So and I try to involve my kids a bit more in that now. They're old enough now that they really get value out of that. So when I came to AAP last year, we stopped in Los Angeles for a couple of days, brought my teenage son and one of his friends, stopped in LA for a couple of days, went to the conference, and then stopped in Texas for a couple of days on the way back, and just got a rental car and went for a drive. So definitely trying to do more and more of it, because otherwise it's just convention centers and hotels, and they're all the same. It doesn't matter where you are, you're just tired, jet lagged, and going from lectures to dinner to lectures to dinner, and you don't really get a sense of what else is out there.
That probably is something you have an advantage of as an Australian too, because y'all are used to things being spread out and having to drive. When Europeans come here, like we went to England a year ago, not quite a year ago, and we would ask a local about this spot, and they're like, "Oh, that's a long ways away." And then you look at it, it's like 2 hours. You're like, "I'll do 2 hours on a Saturday morning. That's nothing," And they were like, "This is something you got to plan 2 months for."
Yeah.
They were really hesitant to. So
Yeah, where we live, everything's 6 to 8 hours away. You know, so we just, if we go away for a weekend's competition, it's typically 6 to 7 hours, 8 if we really push it, and that's just normal. And so, yeah, getting in a car and driving around Texas for 2 days and spending 6 hours in the car each day, just nothing. It's just what we do, and it's, you know, a great way to see the scenes and get out to the countryside and stuff. I'm not a real big city person. I'd much rather get out, hit the gas and get out of town as fast as I can and go and see the rural landscape and the rural people.
This is one of the more controversial questions, so if you want to dip your toe in the water and not fully commit here, I'll understand. But does pineapple belong on pizza?
No, no, it does not.
No hesitation.
My youngest daughter insists on polluting. She's a very good chef, but one of her great weaknesses is she insists on polluting pizza with pineapple. Meat and cheese.
Meat and cheese. I like it.
Yeah. Preferably multiple types of meat and multiple types of cheese.
I'm right there with you. And some black olives, maybe some jalapenos. I like a little something in there, but yeah. What about anchovies? Are you a fish guy on pizza or
yeah,
no?
No.
I'm a little interested to see how you're going to answer this one, because I would tend to think it's one way, but you have just enough of a quirky side to you that I think you could surprise me here a little bit. So, thoughts or feelings? Are you more the cerebral, purely analytical guy, or do you have some go with your gut intuition side to you as well?
I think it's both. I think, like, if I think of it from a point of view, like as a veterinarian, I think we base we should, and we base our basic decisions on fact. You know, there's X amount that we know. I think the challenge in veterinary medicine, particularly equine practice, is the database on which we form our decisions is often really limited. It's actually not a huge amount of information. And so there's a point where, you know, experience plays a role, and experience is double-edged because you get trapped in your own perceptions and experiences. But I think also there is that sense of gut feeling. There's that, I think this is what's going on. And I think particularly I've done a lot of emergency work in my day. And I think particularly for emergency work, a lot of it's that sense of trying to understand or trying to sort of feel what's going to happen next. I think is one of the really valuable skills to develop, and you develop it over time with exposure and experience. So it's going to be a combination of both. I think in some spaces, we've got a lot of stuff that we can make some pretty technical decisions, and in others, we just have to, it's still an art. You know, veterinary science is still it's called veterinary science, but it's still partly an art, and there's a lot of soft science to it as well.
I've kind of come to believe that I think intuition is maybe a more primitive side of the analytical mind. And so, like, there are horses that I'll approach with a problem, and I will know what the problem is, but I won't know how I know it. I can't really express, but I know what's going on here, but I'm not exactly but there's some, confluence of things that I'm seeing, picking up on, whatever, that are giving me a pretty strong idea of what it is. Do you have that sort of thing going on, as like you walk up to a colicky horse and you just know it's this before you've ever?
Yeah, and it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck. It's probably a duck. And I think that's, a lot of veterinary medicine's pattern recognition. And that's where where our experience comes in, is that you see the patterns, and you can see where it's going, or you get an idea of what's going on. I think the challenge as a clinician is always checking yourself on that. And when I teach vet students, I always tell them, you might think you know what's going on, but always have 3 things on your list as possibilities. So it might be the most obvious thing. Don't go looking for the weird thing, but just always put a second and third thing on your list, just so you don't get caught in this loop of, self-fulfilling prophecy. So, but yeah, I think definitely over time, you get really good you get better at recognizing patterns. And those patterns are what sort of just intuitively comes to you, and you go, that's what I've seen this so many times. I know what it is.
So I do have a couple of questions here that are more rider specific, and you're telling me you played A-level polo, so I'm going to
Well,
treat
not
you
A
like a
level.
rider.
I know, very low level.
So the horse was capable of that level, but not you, right? Okay, I
Yes,
got you.
exactly. The horse was a lot better than the rider.
Well, I'll ask you anyway. So right lead or left lead? Do you have a particular lead that's more natural to you and one you have to be more intentional and thoughtful about, or not?
PoloCross, it's always going to be turning to the right. So you're all, if you're a right-hander, the ball's, you're always turning onto the ball. So it's going to be that right lead around onto the right-hand side, and so that would be probably a more natural. Honestly, I don't think that hard about it when I'm riding. If I'm doing a 3-day event and I'm doing dressage, I half think about the lead, but I kind of figure out that's the horse's job. The horse is meant to know which leg it's leading on when it's going in a circle. So that's having been spoiled riding stock horses. They're very good at that. They're very good at picking up their own lead. And when you're playing a game like PoloCross, you don't really have a don't. I mean, maybe the really good guys have time to think about which lead they're on, but you rely a lot on the horse to make those decisions for you. So there's a reason why I don't score very well in dressage. There's a lot of reasons why I don't score well in dressage.
So again, for riding, would you consider your hands or your legs better?
Probably learnt for my hands to be a lot better over time. I was a typical sort of adult rider when I started. I had really hard hands, and it was something that I got a lot of feedback or pushback from my mates who were sort of teaching me to ride. And I think now probably I've got the hand bit sorted. I'm still the legs are still very much a crude instrument of hanging on and then occasionally trying to figure out which lead we want to be on or something like that. But yeah, I certainly don't have that subtlety of a good dressage rider.
Every once in a while, the comedic side of me forces me to do a Venn diagram that I find funny and maybe no one else will. And I may add this one, but I had one that included team ropers, and the thing in the center was I have no idea what my left hand is doing right now. So I would imagine polo can be like that. You get focus on the ball and the mallet, and maybe your left hand is over here, over there. I don't. The horse seems to be on top of the ball, so I'm good. But I don't have any real sense of what I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, so it's PoloCross, not polo. So PoloCross is an Australian version. It's lacrosse on a horse. So instead of hitting the ball, it's a big round soft ball, and you pick it up and you carry it and you throw it. But otherwise, and it's like lacrosse on a horse played on a big netball court is the best way to describe it. Very much like when you're actually in the heat of it, I'd love to tell you that I have this great sense of awareness as to what my legs and arms and hands are doing, but a lot of it's body, and that's the great thing about these well-trained polocross horses is you just turn, you look at the ball, they learn to chase the ball. A lot of it's just you just move your body, and they're just responding to those shifts in weight, and they learn the game too. They learn that it's like a game of cat and mouse, and they learn that. So and that's what really separates a good horse from an average horse is one that you don't have to tell what to do. It's like a good cow horse, it's on the cow, it knows its job. You got to make sure you pilot it and hang on. And that's probably why going across to eventing's been so hard, because I have to actually think about it and control the horse, and that's a real challenge compared to having a horse that just naturally does a lot of that stuff because of its breeding and training.
So is polo cross a contact sport? Because polo and lacrosse both kind of are, or is there an agreement here that we're not going to unhorse anybody with a mallet or a stick or
No, no, you're allowed to go horse on horse. You're not allowed to sort of make direct. You're not allowed to sort of hit from the side, but you very much you call it picking up the other horse. You're very much allowed to ride onto the other horse's shoulder, and you're allowed to push, and you're allowed to block. And so there's a fair bit of it's a very physical sport, and there's a fair bit of horse on horse contact. Yeah, it is that cross between polo and lacrosse.
I like it.
Yeah, it's a good fun.
So I don't know if I'll keep this in here or not, but I played rugby in college. So Australian, I know you'll understand that I like a little you can be smart and still knock the crap out of somebody and sweat and enjoy yourself too, right?
Yeah, I'm the same. I played a lot of Aussie rules footy, and then you reach a point where your body won't let you do that anymore. So so a sport, being able to have a competitive physical sport like PoloCross is great. Like it's also a cool sport because it's played by you play three at a time, and you see sometimes the grandkid, the parent, and the grandparent playing in the same division. You'll have men and women play together. I've played with my teenage sons, my teenage daughters. It's even though it's a physical sport, it's also a very sort of a sport where everyone can participate. It's really based on skill as much as it's not about strength. It's about skill because the horse is doing all the heavy lifting in terms of the physical work.
We just got word too. My son is at Louisiana Tech, where I went to college, and he's playing on the same rugby team, and they're having an alumni game. So I'm going to get to go in May and assert dominance on him and the younger generation one more time, as long as they don't hit me in the knees or something like that. But
and you don't have to run too fast and pull the hamstring.
yeah, I can still run fast, but I don't want to do it for 80 minutes anymore. Like, we need enough of us to swap out, let me blow, catch my breath for, I don't think I'd have the endurance to go the whole round. But anyway, the first part's going to be fun. Besides a horse. Yeah, the first 10 minutes, yes. Besides a horse, what animal would you most like to ride?
Oh, to ride.
It could be mythical too, so you can go with Brontosaurus, Pegasus.
Mythical, you'd have to go a dragon. You'd have to go the Game of Thrones dragon. Like that looks like fun.
It does, absolutely.
Yeah, no one's going to mess with you.
Do you agree that hot dog water is the opposite of holy water?
I never thought about it. I mean, it's got to contain all sorts of interesting things given what's contained in hot dogs. So yeah, it's probably not a bad analogy.
That one's actually provoked some good prank stories from a few people. Do you have, this could be a whole book, but do you have a horse industry related pet peeve?
Yeah. I think it's that there's no bullshit filter in the industry. I think that anyone can say anything, and if they're if they've got a silver enough tongue, they can make people who really, fools are easily parted with their money, and so people who want to buy into that, fine, that's their choice. But where the peeve kicks in for me is well-meaning people who are trying to do the best for their horse getting taken for a ride, and they're not looking for a silver bullet. They want a decent, reasonable answer, and they get taken for a ride. And I think it's that lack of bullshit filter, and the complete charlatans that run around our industry, ripping people off. And I don't think that's fair to the owners, and I don't think it's fair to the horses. Because I think as we get more and more conscious about welfare and well-being, it's not fair to the horses that it doesn't hurt them. Well, it does. It does, because from a veterinary perspective, it's really common that people will come and say, I've already spent this much money, I only have this much money left in my budget. And it's not to say that the vets are the answers to every problem. It's not to say, and the good vets don't see themselves as the answers to every problem. The good vets work with paraprofessionals who are suitably skilled and suitably trained to do, the job. But it's a deep sense of frustration in the industry when someone comes and says, well, I've already spent this much money doing all these other things. Can you fix it for this? And its answer is, well, no, we can't. And so it's that, as I said, it's fools are easily parted with their money. Good luck to them. But it's that honest, genuine horse owner who is really just trying to do the best for their horse. Often everyone's busy. They don't have time to filter through all of the information, critically, and they get taken for a ride.
Yeah, people think that the old-fashioned horse trader that used to screw people for a living is a thing of the past, and it's not. They just sell supplements now instead, right?
Well, and a lot of other things as well. Like, yeah, it's that old. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. And anytime you see something that promises the world, you got to step back from that. Like, it's if it's too good to be true, it probably is.
Are you decisive or indecisive?
Decisive. Yeah.
I like it. Not surprising.
Yeah. I ponder, but then once I make a decision, I move on. There's was it, I think it was the book Blink. There's that whole thing. Do you make a decision instantly or do you make a decision at the last minute? And I sort of fluctuate between the two, but once I've made one, I've made one.
And our last question for you, what is your favorite dinosaur or deep sea creature?
Dinosaur. Oh, you got to go with the good old fashioned T Rex. Like as a kid from the sort of 70s and 80s, T Rex was king. He's not anymore, but he was.
Hmm. Now that we find out he was more goose than lizard, it's a little
Yeah,
disappointing, right? But
yeah. And there's the Gigantosaurus or something. There's a bigger one that
Mhm.
smokes him. But yeah, but back in the day, he was the man.
Well, very good. Let me tabulate your score here. I have very good news. You are our high score of all time. You're the first person to cross the 5,000 points barrier. You are at 5,081 points. So your competitive streak is validated here.
I
Congratulations.
feel seen.
So this either entitles you to an awkward silence or a genuine compliment, your choice.
We'll take the awkward silence. We're men. We don't talk about our feelings too much.
I genuinely wish I could interview an Australian every week. Like y'all just have the greatest sense of humor and don't take yourselves too seriously. It's perfect.
No one else does, so why would we start?
Well, Dr. Sykes, first question for everybody is would you give us the 30,000-foot view of what it is that you do in the horse world?
So my specialty, so my training is equine internal medicine, and then my specialty within that's gastroenterology, and then within that is gastric ulcers. And so really what I focus the majority of my research and my education and work day-to-day work on is looking at gastric ulcers in horses, looking at the research aspects, and then also a lot of educational aspects around that. And that's now starting probably that's now starting to also intersect very heavily with the well-being conversation because it's such an important welfare well-being disease. So it's really it's that gastric ulcer well-being welfare state that I spend most of my time talking about these days or working on and talking about these days.
So what is we kind of have these different syndromes now or syndromes isn't the right word, but like what's the distinction between equine ulcers and glandular disease? What's the lay of the land there?
Yeah, syndromes is actually a really good word, good choice. So we talk about equine gastric ulcer syndrome, and that's an overarching term, basically to just describe diseases of the stomach, ulcerative diseases of the stomach. Um, Within that, we have two separate subsets, and so we have squamous gastric disease, which is the top half of the stomach, and the squamous mucosa effectively is the same as our skin or our esophagus. And very simply, it doesn't like acid. And it's not under normal conditions, it has very limited exposure to acid. And then primarily for management reasons and environmental reasons that we impose on horses, we change those conditions and we get increased acid exposure and we get a chemical burn. And then the other half of equine gastric ulcer syndrome is glandular gastric disease. And it is probably actually better described as a syndrome because it's probably not a singular disease. We know that in humans, there's like 20 different forms of ulcers, and this glandular disease is much closer to, it's the analogous to human ulcers. We, we haven't been able to pull out the different types of ulcers in the glandular mucosa or different types of diseases, but it's clear that there's more than one, and it's clear that they probably affect different populations differently. And so the glandular mucosa is an area of the stomach, the bottom half of the stomach. It normally lives in a ball, it's bathed in acid. Its normal environment is to be in a pH of 1 to 2, which is extremely acidic environment. But what we have is on the lining of the stomach, we have this very thin layer of mucus and bicarbonate that actually means, and that bicarbonate mucus is secreted from the cells from underneath. And what that means is the acid doesn't actually touch the tissue. So although the pH of the liquid might be 1 or 2, at the tissue surface, the pH is still 7. And this is where our knowledge stops and where we think what happens comes in, but we think something's causing that barrier to break down, and then we get the same thing. We get a chemical burn of the underlying tissues, but it's a more complex process. It's more complex because we've got this failure of a normal defense mechanism first. And so it's really important we distinguish those two, because they're effectively different diseases. So we don't really talk about EGUS as a disease anymore. When we're talking about an individual horse, we're talking much more specifically about whether the horse has squamous gastric disease or glandular gastric disease. And then they can have both at the same time, one, the other, or both. And then how we manage that, because the treatment, management, prevention is very different from one to the other.
So is there another form that's more hindgut related, or is this a whole separate kettle of fish and totally unrelated to these two?
It's a separate kettle of fish. So you have your stomach, you have about 22 yards of small intestine, and then you get to the hindgut of the horse. And so you're talking about the colon, the cecum, and we see hindgut disease. I think the critical thing is they're not hindgut ulcers. That terminology was invented by a supplement company and really isn't supported by the evidence. There's no question that horses get hindgut disease, and that hindgut disease is important, but it's not an ulcerative disease primarily. It's inflammatory. It's associated with changes in the microbiota, but it's not a structural change in terms of ulceration in the vast majority of cases. It can occur, but it's very rare for it to occur outside of specific conditions. And so we put that hindgut disease over here as an entirely separate entity that typically is completely unrelated to our squamous disease or glandular disease over here in the stomach. So it's very easy to see how people get confused, because people talk about the bottom of the stomach or the back of the stomach, and it's really separating that terminology. If you're talking about the top of the stomach, the squamous, the bottom of the stomach, the glandular, and then the hindgut, which is the back of the gastrointestinal tract. What I'll say to people is if you went to the vet and they gastroscoped your horse and they saw the ulcer, it's going to be squamous or glandular, because you can't see the hindgut.
Would you, just since most of this is going to kind of be digestion related, would you give us just a brief overview of the digestive parts of a horse, which of course God made up of spare parts from other animals, and kind of give us just the lay of the land, like the cecum? There's probably some people listening that know what's going on there, and I would be willing to bet there's plenty that don't. So would you kind of?
Yeah, so the horse wasn't a fluke, because the horse and the rhinoceros are nearly identical gastrointestinally. If you open up a rhinoceros inside, it looks exactly like a horse's gastrointestinal tract. So it was done twice with different purposes. They just stuck a horn on one and longer legs on the other. So that's your fun fact for the day.
What about tapirs? I'll throw that one in. Are you impressed that I knew that one too? The odd-toed ungulates, that's the 3, right?
Yep. At the 3, a lot of I don't know about tapirs. I mean, alpacas and camels have the 3-chamber stomach, so I suspect tapirs might be the same, but don't quote me on that. Yeah.
Well, when you're at Kilimanjaro, you can check it out. That'll be their neck of the woods there.
Yeah, we'll push the lions away after the kill, and we'll just go over and have a little bit of squiz. Yeah, so I think, obviously we start with dentition and the mouth, we go down through the esophagus into the stomach. And I think what's one of the things that gets forgotten is just how important that first section is. Obviously, dentistry is important to horse health and well-being, but the thing from a gastric ulcer point of view is chewing and saliva. Chewing and saliva are the cornerstone of the natural defense mechanisms for the squamous mucosa. And so I think we forget a lot in modern horse management systems how important it is that horses chew, and that chewing is really important. So we can come back to that. You then hit the stomach, and the stomach there is basically it's a storage chamber in ruminants like cattle and sheep. That's the primary site of fermentation. That's where the grass gets broken down into all the goodies, and the bacteria do most of their work. In the horse, it's largely just a storage vat. It's largely just something that stores the hay. There's some predigestion that goes on, particularly of carbohydrates. And this is one of the reasons why carbohydrates are important for gastric disease, because you do get some fermentation that occurs in the stomach, but it's only there for a relatively short period of time. Liquid moves through the stomach in about 20 minutes. Feed moves through in, 12 to 16 hours. The horse's stomach will empty if we stop feeding it. And then we hit the small intestine. And it's really interesting that you asked about, gastric disease and hindgut ulcers. There's 22 yards of small intestine inside the horse that's responsible for absorption of the majority of the important nutrients for the horse's life. And no one ever talks about small intestinal disease. No one ever, we've got all this discussion around ulcers. We've got all this discussion around hindgut disease, and no one ever talks about small intestinal disease. But the small intestine's, critical to nutrient absorption, particularly. So anytime from a veterinary perspective, anytime we see a horse with weight loss, at least anytime I see a horse with weight loss, I really want to know what that small intestine's doing, because that's the primary driver of nutrient absorption in the horse. And then you get to the end of the small intestine and you hit what's collectively called the large intestine, which consists of the cecum, which is about sort of a meter long blind ending sac, and it's actually the horse's equivalent of the appendix. And we tend to think that the appendix is not important, but it actually is. It's a very important in the immune system, particularly. And in the horse, it acts as the initial fermentation vat. So feed goes into the cecum, and that's where we have our fiber digesting microbes that start breaking down that hay or grass or roughage or whatever's come through into nutrients that can be absorbed by the large intestine. And then from there we get into the colon, and the colon's about a meter long. Blind ending sac goes out, comes back on itself, and it does the same thing. It's the big fermentation vat that goes on the back end of the horse. And then effectively you get to the small colon, the rectum, which is basically a waste disposal system. So depending on the horse's needs, it'll drive up to, approximately 50% of its nutritional requirements from the hindgut fermentation. And a lot of its fine nutrient requirements come from small intestinal absorption. So its energies, the fermentation vat's the energy source, and then a lot of our nutrient absorption is happening through the small intestine of our micronutrients and stuff like that, proteins and those types of things.
So I thank you for that breakdown, and I learned a couple of points in there. I didn't know the cecum was basically the appendix at all. That was an interesting tidbit for me to chew on there. I wanted to go back to the saliva part of it. You may or may not know, most of my work is done with bits. And so salivation and swallowing is something I have gone down many rabbit holes on. And to be honest, I really have, with the research community, and for whatever reason, this seems to be very strongly associated with British researchers. They have a tendency to study and put out research papers on dysfunction, but they don't ever talk about function. So if you are not reading that research with a critical thinking mind, it would appear as though proper function of a horse with a bit in its mouth isn't possible. And I seem to fight this battle of, no, it's possible. They're just telling you half of the story there. So one of my theories is that one of the most important things we can have for function in a horse to have success with the bit is that the horse continues swallowing while they have the bit in their mouth. And anytime we have a state of dysfunction, it kind of all, you could have problems with the tongue and this and that and the other, but all of it bottlenecks down to the horse will cease swallowing. And I look at that behaviorally from a parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system standpoint. But where this ties in with you, I have had the theory for a long time that when we disrupt that chain of swallowing, you do know, but a lot of people might not realize a horse produces about 10 gallons of saliva a day, which has that bicarbonate in it, which is going to the stomach for the protection. So my theory is if I disrupt that 3 or 4 hours a day and there's no saliva being swallowed, then I have negatively affected this situation. Now, do I think it's the thing that's causing ulcers? No, but I think maybe it's a piece of the puzzle of things that could add up to and cause some problems there. So what do you think? Am I totally off base, or does that make some sense?
It's interesting. The last statement you said, the thing that's causing ulcers, unless you take something to an extreme, like starving horses to induce ulcers, unless you take a single factor to extreme, there's not one thing that's causing ulcers in our horses. It is a it is a multitude of factors that have a cumulative effect. And then there's some degree that horses, particularly if we talk about squamous disease, which is, I think of squamous disease, if we're talking about saliva, we're talking about squamous disease. And I think of squamous disease as being 80% environment, 20% horse. And sometimes there's one thing that just overrides everything in that environment. But when we look at most of our riding horses, if we take out the extremes in terms of athleticism, but if we just look at our riding horses, our horses that we use for our recreational riding, our showing, dressage, eventing, hacking, these different sort of disciplines, it is a summation of multiple factors that contribute to disease. It's not one single thing in the vast majority of cases. And so picking off one thing is not going to either cause the problem, but it's also not going to solve the problem. I think that, as I said earlier, that idea of chewing and saliva has been lost in the conversation, because it really is the most important natural defense mechanism is those gallons and gallons of saliva that the horse does. And the way I think of it is there's a basketball inside of hay inside that horse's stomach. And first of all, it has to be strong enough to form a solid ball. It can't be slush, because if it's slush, it's going to splash, the acid's going to splash around. And if we have that ball in place, then the way I think of it is the acid's like a tide. So the acid's being constantly produced, so the tide wants to keep coming in, and then the bicarbonate's constantly pushing that tide back down. And we need to keep that tide pushed back down below the level where the squamous mucosa starts, and we get disease. And so things like bit behavior, things like cross-tying horses for hours, waiting for competitions without access to hay, all of those things I think potentially become contributory factors. And so anything that negatively impacts on that saliva production and flow is going to incrementally increase our risk of disease. It's probably not going to be enough by itself to cause the disease, but when we add that 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, all of a sudden now we have the risk of disease. So yeah, I think it's a very relevant thing to look at. And then I guess the other thing in the world of bits is that, there's a lot of conversation starting up in Scandinavia, particularly about bit lesions and oral lesions in mouths associated with bits. And so the conversation there is around welfare. But if we think back to my world, which is the gastric ulcer world, it's also around eating. And so if a horse has this, we always say, oh, how much hay does the horse have? And the owner says it has as much hay as it wants. It has ad libitum hay. It's like, okay, but how much does it eat? And most people can't answer that question. and the hay doesn't work on the stable floor. The hay doesn't work in a hay net. It has to be inside. So that eating is a behavior, and the implications of bit fitting and stuff like that on pain and oral lesions are really important, because if you've got a sore mouth, you're not going to want to eat roughage as much as if you don't have a sore mouth. So there's and that's a lot of the conversation, is stepping back from, probably for 20 years we've talked all about the stomach, and it's now trying to peg that back and attach it to the rest of the horse, because it's recognition of this multifactorial nature of disease.
So I would say there, just to add on, like I would completely agree that if we have lesions in the mouth that has anything to do with the bit, that we need to make changes there. But that's a state of dysfunction. We shouldn't have that. That's a red flag of problems that need to be, solved in some way.
And I don't know what your experience is, but what would you say when you look at horses? What would you say? What percentage of horses that you look at would have bit associated oral lesions?
Very few. I would say that's probably in the 1, 2, 3% range, something like that. And I would also say that most of the time in those cases, the owner or rider is completely unaware that the horse had any kind of sores in there. I've seen tongues almost cut in half, and the rider had no idea that anything had happened.
Yeah, because interestingly, in other disciplines, we're starting to see some quite high numbers, 30, 40, 50% in some disciplines.
Yeah.
With, bit lesions and stuff like that. So it's a big issue in some spaces of the sport.
Yeah, that's a problem. I mean, for sure, if that sort of stuff is being seen, I try to tell people, I talk a lot about the tongue and how sensitive it is, how communicative it is. The neurology of it is very complex. It is totally built for communication. And so we have a lot more problems in horses that we think are showing a behavioral issue that's much more commonly associated with a heavy-handed rider, because they have just basically sensory overloaded the tongue. And if we can make the rider aware of absolutely how sensitive this thing is, and you do not have to be hard with it at all, then we can, develop a much better level of communication. The horse is happier, the rider's happier. That's where some of the dogma comes in. You have the German dressage person with forearms like a bodybuilder's legs from 78 pounds of contact in the horse's mouth all the time, and we just should not be doing that. That's a real problem. So
yeah, I'm going to share with you an epiphany I had recently along those lines. And so, I've been a horse vet for 27 years, and we talked before about handling horses and getting the job done. And we've started working with off the track thoroughbreds in retraining, and depending on how long the horse has had to let down and the individual horse, that they're a real range. Some of them are absolute Labrador dogs from the day they arrive, and some of them are still pretty highly strung. And historically, one of the things I was taught was, the moment one of these horses bounces around, is to grab a rearing bit or a chiffney bit. I don't know what you would call it what we call it in the US, but the rearing bit, and pop it in that horse's mouth for control. And I think that's a synonym for something that we can whack on to induce discomfort so the horse listens to us. And it's effective. There's no question it's effective in these horses. But being in the retraining space, I said to my wife the other day, we were doing something and a horse was misbehaving, and we sort of did that reflex, went to grab it. And I said, hey, do we really want to do this? Because actually what you're trying to do is you're trying to teach that horse to have a soft mouth, and you've got ride it with soft hands, and to be really responsive. Do we really want to be putting a rearing bit in this horse's mouth and pulling down on it in a very crude way to get the job done? And that was something that I hadn't thought of in 27 years. But it's moving into that different space and recognizing, because it's counterproductive in that space, I think, to be pulling on their mouths, when actually we're trying to teach them to be very soft mouthed, which is not something that's naturally been trained into them as ex-race horses.
And on the nervous system side of things, what you're guaranteeing, if you go that route, is that you're going to put the horse into fight or flight, and now we have enough oomph to control them in fight or flight, but we also purposefully put them there
Yeah.
and this is not a space where they can actually learn or calm down or regulate, bringing them into the parasympathetic where they can relax and observe and learn and process. That's a much better long-term strategy, I would say.
Yeah, and look, there's a time and a space for it as a veterinarian. Like
Yeah,
I mean, there's still times when at the end of the day, we've got to get the job done. We've got to get the control. And so don't read this as saying, that we shouldn't be doing it. But I think it's just when we do it, understanding that interplay between what are the objectives of, and I think these retrainers, particularly, a lot of it is teaching them to relax with a bit in their mouth and be soft and responsive. It can be really counterproductive there. I think when we've got a stallion that's covering mares and he's running around on three legs, we're going to want to have control, and maybe that's the way we need to have control. I think it's horses for courses, but it's probably just that awareness of that interaction that has changed for me, at least in the last very recent times.
I probably jumped ahead of myself a little bit here with the questions because I was wanting to get into your specialty here because it does interest me. But you have had a pretty interesting career path as well, as you alluded to in the icebreaker questions. You really didn't set out to become a horse vet at all. So would you take us back to veterinary school and kind of the track that you were on and how that road forked for you?
Yeah, I didn't set out to do any of this really. It was sort of just fortune and opportunity. So, I went into vet school very much, grew up in a small country town on a small beef sheep farm, and sort of had every intention of just sort of being the James Herriot mixed practice veterinarian. Went through vet school, really enjoyed all aspects of that. And I think one of the real advantages we have in our vet schools in Australia, it's a double-edged sword, but I think one of the real advantages is we're not forced to track early. We stay in a general track until the very, very end, and then we get to choose which path we want to go down. I think one of the significant contributory factors to the shortage of horse vets in the US is the need for people to track early. And you don't get the me's. You don't get the vets who have nothing to do with horses until they actually get to vet school and go, hey, I actually like this. And so I was really lucky. I did my equine rotation towards the end of my final year of vet school when I was just getting into that, get a job, figure out what to do stage. And I had one of the surgeons who was supervising us tap me on the shoulder and said, hey, Ben, have you ever thought about doing horses? I'm like, no. And she goes, well, you should. You seem to enjoy it. You're good with them. I think you'd fit well into this world. And so I went home and I thought about it, and I came back the next day and I said, well, if I wanted to be a horse vet, what would I do? And she said, well, here, apply for this job. And I remember she gave me the piece of paper and she said, apply for this job in Sydney. And this place is the bee's knees. They have all the toys. They have a gastroscope. This is back in the 90s. They have a gastroscope, which was like, ooh, really, I think it was probably the only private practice in Australia with a gastroscope. And so I went, oh, okay, so I applied for the job and I went and interviewed. I'd been at the Melbourne Cup festival, which is basically, it's like the Kentucky Derby, but goes for a week. And so there's 4 race days over a 7-day period. And so I'd been at the Melbourne Cup for the week when I showed up to my interview, and I was completely useless. I was just the dumbest person in the history of time for my week-long interview. But I was fortunate enough that they called up for my reference, and the dean of the vet school at the time was also a very well-known equine surgeon, and he gave me the pat in the back. He said, well, don't worry, he'll get the job done, And so I went off and did my internship, and it was a baptism of fire. I went from very little horse experience to working in a very busy racetrack practice with young, highly fit, highly tuned racehorses. So it was a very, very steep learning curve. And I tell vet students, this is normal, but I was the dumbest person alive for the first 3 months of my vet career. Like, I knew nothing. I was just surviving. Kept showing up and got the job done. And then sort of continued from there. And a couple of years later, a friend called up and said, oh, do you want to come to America and do a medicine residency? And I was, Yeah, sure. Why not? I'd sort of got an interest in medicine. So I went and spent a couple of years in Virginia, Northern Virginia, did my postgraduate training in equine internal medicine. And then from there was sort of just starting to ponder what I'd do next. And someone who became ultimately a good friend and colleague was visiting and said, "Do you want to come and work in Finland for a while?" And I was like, "Where's Finland?" And so I had to get the map. I knew it was up there somewhere, but I had to get the map out and figure out which one was which. And oh, okay, yeah, it's next to Russia. And so they offered me a job, and I went for 12 months and stayed for 6.5 years, and worked initially at the university, then private practice, and then 15 years ago moved back to Australia and sort of switched from clinical practice to more focused on research and education stuff, and have been doing that ever since.
So I have to ask, what does the digestive tract of a young guy from Australia do when it goes to Finland? Were you prepared for all the oily fish, or was that a shock to your system?
The fish is more of a Swedish thing. So there's some fish in Finland and that, but Finland's very much a meat and potatoes kind of country. So it was actually quite similar, meat, potatoes, and they've got their rye bread. So very similar in a lot of ways, despite the obvious social differences of language and stuff. In many ways, Finland is not dissimilar from Australia. Very outdoorsy, sausages on the barbecue type lifestyle, beer.
Doesn't sound too bad, let me tell you. So I am guessing one change would be that you're now in a place where there's snow and ice on the ground 6 months out of the year. So what does a cold environment like that do to change the life of a horse? Like, we're talking about them grazing X number of hours a day, and now we've got horses for a large part of the year that are in an environment where grass isn't necessarily there, or it has to be worked for a lot harder. So how did that again shift your career a bit?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it worked back the other way too, because my wife, who's Finnish, had come from that environment and came to Australia, and we have the opposite. So, we have our horses live out 24/7, and we have shelters for them. We rug them if the weather's inclement, but really, they live outside, and that's the normal here. And then we go. I spent that time in Northern Virginia, and we actually snow, and it wasn't as cold in Northern Virginia, but we certainly got plenty of snow. The snow was part of that, and the changes in the horse lifestyle. And I think what's really interesting in the big picture is if you look at probably 20 years of work and research and discussion, the Scandinavians or the Nordic countries have really been ahead of the curve in that conversation, saying, well, we recognize that where we're putting the horses is not their natural environment in Africa. And so, what does that mean for horse health and welfare? And there's been a really large body of work done in those Nordic countries looking at the influence, the impact, particularly from a welfare perspective, of different management systems on horses. And the take home really is that as long as they've got adequate roughage, they'll tolerate extreme cold. They grow hair and they eat. And then what they do is they increase their roughage intake, because that fermentation in the hindgut is also their heat source. And so they literally just increase their food consumption to increase their heat production. And so they'll do that. And they prefer to live outside even when the weather is bad, short of extreme, like, cyclonic winds. And wind is the thing that's really, damaging for them in terms of behaviorally. But in terms of cold, they don't mind the cold. They actually adapt to the cold very well, as long as they've got appropriate roughage. And so it's when we talk about, to me, the three real principles of horse welfare, well-being, are friends, forage, and freedom. And we can meet those under any of those conditions. If we can meet those in Finland at minus 30 degrees Celsius, we can meet them anywhere in the world. And it's not whether we can do it, it's whether we have the will to do it, and the commitment to do it, because it's not easy, but it can be done. So there's a real push in that world away from that individual stabling of horses, that's that traditional modern way of stabling horses, even in those extreme conditions, towards friends, forage, and freedom.
So let me ask you this, and I understand this is be more subjective than objective, but like there's some pretty good empirical research on the changes made to a horse in our modern way of keeping them in stalls and so forth versus having them out. So within our the things we can influence through husbandry and environment, what would you say keeping horses up in stalls versus being out? What part of the ulcer or glandular disease does that play? Is it a contributing factor, a major factor, or not at all?
So if we think about squamous disease, it's about roughage and roughage consumption and how we consume roughage. There's carbohydrates and exercise also play a role, but the central tenet is going to be roughage. We know, for example, if we give a horse a walk in and walk out opportunity and you put hay in both, they spend more time eating outside. Their preference is to be outside. And so I think we have a lot of opportunities, even when we can't go to, okay, they can't go to a paddock, but we have a lot of opportunities to say, well, can we make a stall to a walkout? And we give them those opportunities. And it never ceases to amaze me. All of our horses have shelter, and it never ceases to amaze. I never see them in the shelter. It doesn't matter how hot it is, they're out grazing. It doesn't matter how, we don't get super cold where I live, but we'll get rainy and wet and windy, and they're out grazing. They very rarely, there's one or two horses, the older horses will go and find shelter, but the rest of them just stay out grazing. And so their preference for freedom is really high. So I think that's really important from a roughage perspective. And the other thing that, from the squamous disease point of view, is there's this inherent, and it's a false assumption, that pasture protects against squamous disease. And that's simply not true. It's more complex than that. And it's the roughage protects against squamous disease. And in fact, pasture is not necessarily always great roughage. And we can loop back to that. From a glandular disease point of view, we think of it as a stress-based disease. And the great thing for me, and this is where we started out, where I said, I'm drifting from gastric ulcers into well-being. Well, there's a real intersection there. And the good thing is everything we do that's good for gastric health is good for well-being. There's very few things that we would say, do this for gastric health, that aren't a well-being positive as well. But if we think of it as a stress-based disease, being able to reduce behavioral stresses. And you said before, they'll have these oral lesions and they won't show it. It doesn't mean it's not a stressor for them. We know that. We know that they're very good at not showing things, or that their language of communication is different. So if you take Sue Dyson's ridden pain ethogram, what she showed is that's their language of pain. It's just that we haven't been listening. We've been thinking about it as behavior, not pain. And then the last is, and this is true of gastric disease, but also of a lot of, if we look at data on orthopedic disease, some of Sue Dyson's data, up to 70% of horses have some degree of musculoskeletal discomfort. So adaptation and threshold tolerance building is all around well-being. If we know from humans, if you're in a good general mental state, you tolerate chronic low-grade pain a lot better than if you're in a poor mental state. And I think it's reasonable to extrapolate that across to horses and look for that role of positive well-being and positive experiences in their ability to adapt to our life. So that's and a lot of that is, there's very few things that if you study it, there's very few things that say, going back, apart from this pasture thing specifically, there's very few things that say you go back to that friends, forage, freedom. There's no downside, and there's universal positives to horses when you study friends, forage, and freedom.
So it would be fair to say that if I had a horse that I knew I had ulcer problems with, if I could get him out of the stall and kick him out, I still need to manage him. I'm not saying I kick him out and forget about him, but I can get him out. He's with his friends. He's got constant forage. Hopefully we're not talking about a dirt lot. We're talking about a pasture that actually has grass and things for him to eat in it. Then that would be a significant chunk of the picture toward getting him on a better track.
Well, even a dirt lot with forage ticks the boxes for friends, forage, and freedom. So I don't think, and often, part of the problem I think is that we have to be willing to meet people in the middle with what they have and what they can do. And so we can get, we as in researchers or whoever can get very sanctimonious about what needs to be done. But if it can't be done, it can't be done. And then you breed a barrier. Well, if I can't do that, I won't do anything. It's like, okay, that doesn't work, and we know that doesn't work in humans for obesity management and stuff like that. You've got to find people, you've got to find common ground, and you've got to find middle ground. And so dirt lots would be a really good example. So we're doing some research at the moment looking at, so there's been a bunch of research done on pasture turnout. And the take home is that pasture turnout per se is not protective against squamous disease. Um, Probably because when you think about grass, if you think about modern pasture, it tends to be very lush and very watery type grass. Now, if you chew that up, you create soup. And so acid's still going to splash around. B, if we look at the amount of grass that a horse would eat normally to maintain that 1.5% dry matter intake, they need to eat 120 to 150 pounds of grass a day. Now, I would suggest, I was in California a couple of weeks ago. I didn't see a single paddock that had 120 pounds of grass for that horse per day. And a lot of the time is when those pastures are grazed down, we end up with really short stem fiber. So short stem fiber, they don't chew as much, so they're not making as much saliva. And short stem fiber hits the stomach and forms soup. And then the third potential thing is that pasture can be really high carbohydrate. So we know some of these Kentucky grasses, Kentucky bluegrass and stuff, can be up to like 25% carbohydrate. And that's a lot of sugar to go into that horse's stomach. And we know that carbohydrates are a driver of disease. So it's moving away from the idea that pasture itself is inherently protective. And when we say forage, I'm actually talking about roughage. I'm talking about hay. So if I have a horse out on pasture, I also look to supplement that with hay. Now, whether that is the entire time in pasture, whether that's pre-exercise when it's most beneficial, depends on the scenario. But I would take, from a squamous disease risk point of view, I'd almost go as far as to say that a horse that has turnout in a nice dry lot with a friend and adequate and appropriate roughage is as good, if not potentially better situation from a squamous disease point of view than a horse that's out on very low quality, dry, short stem pasture, or a horse that's standing there with lush, super green grass that's very high in carbohydrate. So I think a lot of times we can actually find the way if we're looking for it.
That's very interesting. I was going to ask you, I didn't know if we may have a language barrier here, if roughage equated to forage or grass, or if you were specifically talking about hay. So you answered that very well.
Hay, haylage, think stalkiness. Think something that's stalky.
So
And think
actually looks unappetizing to us as something to eat, right? You actually,
yeah. And that's the problem with modern hay is that we walk into the feed store and everyone wants to go to that really nice, soft, this beautiful looking hay. And it's dairy cow hay. A lot of the hay that's getting fed to horses is dairy cow hay, way above the nutritional requirements of horses and not fulfilling that need of, chewing and roughage. We want to, I think more about munchy hay, talking about munchy hay, which is walk down to the end, the back, the stuff that it's got to still be hygienically good quality. It's still got to be well made hay, but the stuff that is stalkier and drier, and think about, if I chewed that hay, how much more would I have to chew than if I chewed that hay? And you want the hay that you got to chew more of. It's got to be palatable because they've got to want to eat it. It's a behavior, but you want the stuff that requires a lot of chewing, because the stuff that requires a lot of chewing is going to make more saliva, more protection. And the stuff that requires more chewing is naturally going to be stalkier and be better at forming that ball within the horse's stomach.
Does protein play any role in this as far as y'all can tell?
Well, I think protein, I mean, you know, from a nutritional point of view, obviously protein's important. The way we feed our competition horses is we focus on the hay is there for roughage, the hay is there for chewing, the hay is there for bulk and for fermentation. And then we balance their diets with appropriate concentrate feeding, which is where we bring our protein content into it. So if we want to increase their protein content, we do that through the choice of concentrate feed that we feed our horses. And that the hay, I'm more focused on the hay being a roughage source and being something to chew on and form a ball in the horse's stomach, and the protein coming from that additional feeding. And we've got plenty of options to do that. We can really, you know, we've got protein balancers, we've got complete feeds that have, you know, very well described nutritional ingredients or nutritional profiles. And so that's the way I look at it. It's taking a step. I think of hay as a roughage and fuel source, not as so much the nutrient source.
So taking that into account, this kind of brings up another thought of mine, and some of these questions, frankly, I don't know if they're worldwide. I'm only experienced with this within the U.S. So I've got a few of these. So for instance, in the U.S., there's a pretty strong trend, and it's existed for maybe a decade now, of going to higher fat, lower starch feeds. And there's a pretty strong, I don't know if this has any legs on it whatsoever, or if it's just one of these dogmatic things we say, but there's a pretty strong belief that the starchier stuff is contributing to the ulcers. You haven't mentioned that once yet. So do you see a correlation there with the starchier stuff? And is the high fat an unnecessary ingredient or not at all a component in this picture? How does that?
So there's a couple of parts of that. So we know that non-structural carbohydrates, starch, sugars can play a really important role in squamous disease risk, particularly because what happens effectively is they get in the stomach and they ferment in the stomach. They make volatile fatty acids, and those volatile fatty acids contribute to worsening of disease over and above the hydrochloric acid. The thing is that when you look at the experimental work, and when you look at the epidemiological work, the amount of carbohydrates to induce that is quite high. And so generally the threshold used is around about 1 gram per kilogram per meal. And so that's 500 grams. So that's about 10 pounds, or 11 pounds of a 20% sweet feed. No one in the riding horse world is feeding their horse that, I hope. Now, if we push into endurance horses or high, you know, some of our eventers and stuff like that, they start getting higher energy requirements. So carbohydrates are really important when they're fed.
And that's per one meal, not per day that you're talking about.
That's per meal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 10 pounds a day might be reasonable, but 10 pounds twice a day, that's a different deal.
Of a 20% feed, which very few, you know, the US has really moved away from this. So the US has largely solved this problem unless people are doing their own thing, you know, or some of our really high performance horses. So carbohydrates are important when fed in excess. And so I think of them as like red wine. So if I have a glass of red wine a day, moderation, it's fine. It's not going to hurt me. In fact, it may actually have some benefits to my overall health. If I have 2 bottles of red wine a day, it's bad. And so there's been the US has pushed, and then there's one group that's gone all the way to say you can't feed horses carbohydrates if they've got a history of ulcers. And that's just not true. We shouldn't be feeding any horse excessive carbohydrates because of the risk of ulcers. And so, but if we look at modern diets, if we look at what's made for modern sports horses, and we do that maths, then we're very comfortable that we're very rarely do we exceed 0.5 gram per kilogram per meal. Like we're really well below that. And then the question is about fat. Adding fat is a great way for those horses that have higher energy needs of getting additional energy in the diet without having to keep pushing the carbohydrates up. So as we increase the energy requirement, we can carbohydrates can play a certain role, and then we add fat to the top as a way of free calories, basically, because fat's basically free calories to horses with, minimal, if any, medical implications. The question is, does the average sport horse need all of those calories? And that varies from horse to horse, because on the other end of the coin, we have the obese horse where they're eating this calorically dense food, they're eating this high quality hay, and so the response to that is then to restrict the amount of hay they get. And from a gastric point of view, that's the worst thing we could possibly do. So if I have a high performance horse that's a hard keeper, it's going to be getting the best hay I can find. It's going to be getting a high fat, moderate carbohydrate to maintain its energy needs and nutrient needs. If I have an easy keeper, it's going to be getting munchy hay and a low calorie supplemental feed. And that low calorie would be low carb and low fat.
So one of the reasons I bring up the fat, I try to say this about every chance that I get, because it's one of those facts about horses that seems very, very counterintuitive to me. And that is that roughage in the cecum is broken down into fats largely. And so when you're feeding a horse roughage, you actually are supplying them with fat, even though it looks like the most nutrient deficient thing, this stalky, nasty, doesn't look like fat would be involved in that picture, but when it chemically changes in the hindgut, that is what's going on. So if we feed a higher fat deal for the average horse and we're on a high roughage diet, is there a too much fat scenario where we're going to have problems?
Not too much fat per se, but yeah, you're right. Like that conversion, there's trillions of microbes. That's their entire job is to convert roughage into volatile fatty acids to be absorbed in the hindgut. The fat that we feed is absorbed in the small intestine. So it's this role of the small intestine absorbing. So when we feed, a high fat diet, it's being absorbed in the small intestine, and then the microbes in the hindgut are doing their job as well. It's more an issue of the total caloric requirements of the horse and the challenges we have in modern horse management of obesity, and then the implications of obesity on particularly laminitis, which is the biggest one, on horse health, and then balancing that. And it's kind of like it's the same analogy in humans. Is if we look at humans and obesity, and it's that the higher the process, the more calorically dense the diet, the less of it we can eat. Otherwise, we run into obesity problems. But the problem with the horse is we don't want them eating less. We want them eating a lot of roughage all of the time. So then it becomes about making sure that the quality of that is matched to the horse's needs. And then I always think of that as the absolute base. And then on top of that, the supplemental feeding is to that horse's requirements. And so our competition horses all eat a very similar diet, but the amount is adjusted depending on that horse's individual needs. We've got some very easy keepers that get very little supplemental feeding and vitamin mineral balancer, and that's it. And we've got some hard keepers that eat 3 times as much to do exactly the same amount of work, vitamin mineral balanced as well. But the hay base stays the same. You could argue for the hard keepers, we could feed them a better quality hay, but that's just a management choice. We'd rather top them up with the supplemental feeding because it's management easier. And we're still well below all those thresholds of a gram per kilogram, and their total daily intake being, or their total meal intake actually is the big one, being appropriate.
So Dr. Sykes, I knew I was having a world-renowned expert on ulcers, and I always do try to go out and find the perfect sponsor for the episode. So, and you had mentioned critical thinking earlier on, and I kind of view that as a job requirement here to challenge people's thoughts. So, our sponsor for this episode is Toots Be Gone. Are you sick of your horse smelling like a vegan who just got back from Burning Man? Have you picked up your last hind foot for picking out and wound up puking up? If your horse passing gas is something you want in the past, Toots Be Gone is here to help. Probiotics and prebiotics are all the rage these days. Well, guess what feeding those gut bacteria really does? They produce gases like methane. Methane is killing the planet. Your horse is killing the planet. Toots Be Gone is the new supplement that will bring those gut bacteria under control and end the gassy toots from the roots. Having bacteria in your horse's gut doesn't sound good, does it? Well, we don't think so either. Did you know that horses are considered hindgut fermenters? Well, fermentation is how they make beer. It's irresponsible to let your horse suffer from alcoholism. You thought that farts were simply unpleasant. Well, does knowing your horse has a winery under your tushy make some of those behavioral problems come into focus? We're saving the planet and drying up the equids all at once. How much more virtuous can you get? As happenstance goes, we've also got a line of synthesized vitamins and complex nutraceuticals that will benefit your horse greatly once you've killed off the bugs that have actually been feeding him all along. Saving the planet and stamping out flatulence isn't easy, but it's manageable and we're here to help. End the gas, save the grass. Canter off on a sober horse for once. What could be better? And just to be clear, our method of ending the gassiness doesn't lead to unpleasant burping either. Two benefits in one. Toots Be Gone. Let's make the smell of a horse just the one smell, shall we?
So, Daniel, I have a question on that. Can I get a hair analysis done to tell me which of the Toots Be Gone specific formulations is best suited for my horse?
Only on the third Tuesday of a month during the half waxing moon cycle, I believe. I think that's how that goes. I could be wrong. I know Jupiter factors in somehow, but I can never remember exactly how it is. But anyway.
And you didn't know this, but I actually got some and I tried it.
Okay, how'd it go?
Yeah, no, really good. So you were asking about favorite color of horse before, and so I'll show you the before and after pictures. But I had this horse, I put it on it for 3 months. Started out as this scrubby, brown, boring horse. Month later, it was a bay, light bay, beautiful coat, long dark mane. Transitioned to a paint, and now it's a red sorrel. And I've always wanted a red. I said there's no red sorrels in Australia. I have the one that I know of, thanks to Toots Be Gone.
That is a wonderful testimonial. We will definitely be adding that to the billboards and the radio ads and everything else. So that's great.
Never seen anything quite like it. Almost too good to believe.
Absolutely, yes, sir. And I mean, you could try it yourself too if you've been having a little bit of that problem or you got a long car trip coming up. I mean, squirt here and there, bound to help, right?
Hopefully, it'll change my grey hair back to my glory days.
Well, on a more serious note, since we are talking about roughage, and again, this is one of these questions that I don't know the answer worldwide, but there is again a strong belief that here in the U.S. feeding alfalfa to horses will be beneficial or preventative for ulcers. And I've heard that a couple of different ways. One is that alfalfa is high in calcium, and so the calcium, just like we might take a Tums, kind of has that effect. So I'm also alfalfa is a legume, not a grass hay, and so I don't know if alfalfa is readily available worldwide or if there might be other legumes that may also, it's more of a legume thing rather than an alfalfa thing. So what is the lay of the roughage land as far as legumes and alfalfa and its effect on ulcers look like?
Yeah, it's one of those language quirks. We call it lucerne for some
Okay.
reason. It's exactly the same, but we call it lucerne instead of alfalfa. Alfalfa is something you put on your salad if you eat salads. So the answer is a qualified yes. And so is alfalfa a beneficial part of the horse's diet? Yes. Does alfalfa have potentially positive benefits for squamous gastric health? Yes. And then we can come back to glandular gastric health as a secondary issue because it's actually almost been demonized in glandular gastric health. But it's qualified. on a couple of things. So the first thing is we recognize that alfalfa as a component of the roughage base of the diet is good. We recognize that in our diet that's totally alfalfa is too high in calcium, and our calcium phosphorus ratio is unbalanced. So from a nutrition point of view, our base roughage remains a suitable and appropriate grass hay, and we're using the alfalfa on top of that to add additional benefits, particularly its protein content from a nutritional point of view. From a gastric point of view, alfalfa has some potential benefits in the sense that it has that calcium content and has some natural buffering capacities. The critical thing is, though, it goes back to the conversation we were having before about chewing. And so I think one of the worst things that's happened in the US for gastric health in the last 5 years has been this drive towards alfalfa cubes and alfalfa pellets as a pre-exercise feed-in to reduce gastric disease risk on the basis that it's alfalfa. The thing is yes, it's alfalfa and has buffering capacity, but when we make it into cubes and pellets, we're missing out the other really important elements of pre-exercise feeding. Those being the value of long stem roughage in terms of forming an appropriate roughage ball, not soup, and the role of long stem roughage in chewing. And so we know if you compare alfalfa hay to alfalfa pellets, horses chew more than 4 times as much eating hay, a nutritionally equivalent amount of hay, than they do pellets. That's 4 times as much chewing. That's a lot more saliva, and we've got a physical structural integrity to that. So is feeding alfalfa as part of the horse's diet potentially beneficial? Yes. The other thing is we know that when we feed hay, we get a buffering effect. And so it's never made any sense to me to feed alfalfa from a gastric health point of view, to feed alfalfa at the same time as we're feeding the meal. So, when we go out, we give the morning meal, we throw a biscuit or a flake of alfalfa, and we do the same again in the afternoon. That really doesn't make any sense because the horse is already eating, it's already creating saliva, it's already creating buffer. Where we get the most bang for our buck for alfalfa is when we feed it around the periods of time where we have the greatest exposure to acid. So that's primarily exercise. So feeding pre-exercise alfalfa. Very first thing in the morning when we want to break that overnight fasting cycle for the horse, or very last thing in the evening when we want to encourage the horse to eat through into the evening as much as possible and build up as much defense mechanisms before it rests and stops eating and that acid starts building up. So, and if we're going to do that, it should be alfalfa hay, not alfalfa pellets or cubes. The other real benefit of that is when we get into the conversation about glandular disease and we talked about this idea of managing chronic pain and well-being and shaping relationships, pre-exercise feeding is a great way of doing that for most horses. It's changing that. Most of our riding horses are food orientated. That can be alfalfa cubes and pellets if our goal is a behavioral outcome. But if our goal is to maximize defense mechanisms of the horse's stomach, it should be alfalfa hay, and ideally kind of stalky type hay that's still highly palatable rather than that really leafy stuff. So it's a very qualified yes.
So is there any difference in like alkalinity or acidity of legume hay versus grass hay?
Yeah. So it does have natural buffering capacity, and that is one of the components. So if you fed an equivalent amount of alfalfa hay, all else being equal to an equivalent amount of grass hay, you're going to get additional benefit from it being alfalfa. But not when we're talking alfalfa cubes or pellets versus, say, grass hay. If you gave me the choice of alfalfa cubes or pellets versus highly palatable grass hay for pre-exercise feeding, I would take the highly palatable grass hay every day of the week.
Well, I have so many questions. It's hard to keep this all straight. So you mostly have talked about the squamous version, which is again the top half of the stomach that should not be exposed to acid. So let's get a little more into the glandular aspect of it. these really are two totally separate, unrelated events that appear the same way, or is there some relationship between them? Or
They're as similar as you and I sitting in this room together. You know, we we live on different sides of the world, very different. We share a conversation around horses. Squamous and glandular are the same. They live in the same apartment, but they're very distinctly different diseases. And in fact, there's very little crossover between them in terms of when we talk about risk factors. So, you know, the things that you talked before about causing disease, and we talk about risk factors. And we said that's very rarely the one thing that causes a disease. It's this summation of little effects. And the lingo is that we refer to those as risk factors. So it's these little things that build up to cause disease, these little risk factors that build up to cause disease. And there's very little crossover between the risk factors for squamous disease and the risk factors for glandular disease. I think of them effectively as entirely separate entities in the vast majority of cases.
so, and I'll just say this here. I mentioned it in the introduction of you, but you were the lead author on the worldwide consensus statement paper on ulcers. And so does that statement address both of these? We kind of have a fork in the road of here's A, what it looks like, here's B, what it looks like. So what kind of would those pictures, like if we had a horse that's presenting with the squamous side, what signs might we see as an owner, and what does that treatment path look like versus the glandular side?
Yeah, and when we did that consensus statement, the very first thing we did is said we need to sit down and separate this terminology, because at the time it was just equine gastric ulcers and it was all clumped together. And so it was really separating them. And so squamous, we've talked about 80% environment, 20% horse, and it's around the things that we've talked. The only one we haven't really talked about is exercise, but it's around roughage. There's a lot of things that make up small pieces, but to me, the big three roughage, the type, the timing, and the amount of roughage, the non-structural carbohydrates, the sugars and starches in the diets, which we've talked to largely solved, and then exercise. And it's the amount of exercise and the timing of exercise is relevant to squamous disease. Glandular disease is much more a disease of stress. And so we see a relationship with exercise, but it's the number of days they exercise per week. And so it's the absence of rest days or needing to have rest days as a preventative measure. And then it's around things like concurrent disease, like musculoskeletal disease, saddle fit issues, and other causes of pain we see as potential drivers of disease. And then around factors, behavioral factors. So, for example, the number of the number of handlers or the number of riders increasing has been shown to be a risk factor. So it really reinforces that it's a behavioral stress-based disease. And I think of glandular as 80% horse and 20% environment, because it seems to be a much more horse level event. In terms of treatment, squamous is the Gastrogard's been the cornerstay of that for many years and remains the cornerstay of that. For glandular, it's a little bit more complex. We look at Gastrogard, we look at sucralfate as a barrier protectant, we look at misoprostol as an alternative drug, and there's various versions of those drugs that are used. And then when we get to prevention, I think of squamous, we have this very sort of dichotomous way of squamous where we think we treat, we cure the disease, and then we prevent the disease. And I think that's appropriate for squamous because we can cure the disease, make it go away, and we prevent it. For glandular, I think of it more as a continuum. So one of the biggest limitations we have for glandular is what we see when we look at the stomach is not a great reflection of what's actually happening in the tissue. We can actually have quite extensive changes in the tissue and it can look normal. And we know it's an inflammatory gastritis. We know that basically there's an increase in inflammatory cells. So I tend to think more of glandular as we treat it, we suppress it, and then we aim to manage it long term. I don't know that we try and prevent it from coming back, or we try and manage it and keep it quiet. So it's similar, but just slightly different, because we can kind of think of squamous as fixed when we've fixed it and fixed the environment, whereas glandular, I think, is always lurking there. And how we do that is really important by recognizing those differences in risk factors. So if we think about prevention, it's to remove the things that contribute to disease in the first place. So the ones we've talked about for squamous, and then they're different for glandular. So we look at focusing on different things for glandular.
So food, forage, and friends, what is that? Or that is squamous?
Friends, forage, and freedom, I think, are cornerstones for squamous. But also forage is probably less central to well, it is. Forage is less central to glandular disease from a direct point of view. But friends, forage, and freedom are all welfare, well-being, behavioral stress important things. So all those things we do to improve well-being should theoretically have flow-on benefits to glandular disease or glandular gastric health.
So this is another thing that this is kind of bringing up for me, and I'm thinking here of the typical horse that I've seen that has stereotypies behavior. So things like cribbing, stall weaving, things like that. There are some patterns in those horses. For instance, I can't really think of a horse I've ever seen that was down that road that I would describe as dumb. They're almost always one of the smartest horses in the barn, and thus boredom is a much bigger problem for them than the gelding that's happening to just kind of, he's got white noise going between his ears all day long. And so that would seem to me the stress would be higher naturally in that horse. Is that a horse? Like, I have seen a lot of those horses that also had ulcer problems. Is that more likely a glandular issue than
Yeah.
squamous? Okay.
Yeah, and that's and so when we talk about the clinical signs or symptoms, but technically they're not symptoms, they're clinical signs, because symptoms are what you tell the doctor, and obviously the horse is not telling us. But when we talk about clinical signs, squamous disease, we typically associate, and these are generalizations, with reduced appetite and poor body condition, poor head. The horse looks like it's sort of loses condition, loses hair coat and stuff like that. Glandular disease we associate much more with behavioral change, and I think change is the critical word there. So when we see behavioral change, we have a much stronger association with glandular disease. And the typical glandular disease horse actually has normal body condition, normal hair coat, outwardly looks very healthy, but it's more of an inwards manifestation. And their way of expressing that is behavioral change, commonly during riding. We see some crossover with squamous. Squamous can do the same thing. Like if it causes discomfort during riding, they can also have behavioral change, but glandular is much stronger around the behavioral change in the horse and the behavioral interactions with the horse, or the horse's general behavior. Yeah. Stereotypies are sort of a bit different in their own right. Like stereotypies are sort of their own little space that aren't necessarily directly related. Windsuckers are actually got an increased risk of squamous disease, and that's probably because it splashes the acid up every time they windsuck, and probably because they're spending less time eating hay. The relationship between stereotypies and glandular disease is not terribly well established, partly because stereotypies are fortunately relatively rare, so it's hard to show strong associations.
So the glandular horse that's showing these things behaviorally, this might be the horse that's girthy or wants to kick at your feet when you're touching them on the sides, or maybe wants to buck a little bit. That's more the kind of presentation, or not
Yeah, and so
necessarily.
so that presentation's the classic of what has historically been assigned to ulcers. People say, "Oh, my horse is ulcery because it's doing that." And then also aversive, what I would call aversive behavior under saddle. And what I mean by aversive behavior is undesirable behavior in response to a stimulus. So, you put the leg on and the horse doesn't react the way you want it to. It kicks out, flicks its tail, pins its ears back, whatever. What and this is where the step back from stomach ulcers comes. And this is the strange thing. This is the weird thing for the stomach ulcer guy to say. But when you see that, don't think ulcers, think pain. So when we see that change, I think is really important. It's really important to separate undesirable behavior from what I would call aversive behavior, because not all undesirable behavior is abnormal. stallions being stallions, mares being mares. That's normal. Horses have a spectrum of personality. Some are very soft and compliant, some not so much. The 2-day-old foal that backs up to you and tries to nail you every time you walk in the stall, that's who that foal is. That's who that foal is probably going to be its entire life. That's undesirable behavior, but that's not necessarily what I would call aversive behavior. What I think we're looking for is when we see our well-trained horses change in their behavior, what you should think of is not ulcers, but pain. And think of that as this is the horse's language of pain. So girthiness, pinning ears back during tacking up, biting, aversive behavior during riding. Think of them as manifestations of pain, of which gastric ulcers is one of the possibilities. The other big one, and this is what Sue Dyson has shown us, is musculoskeletal pain. Lameness causes the same thing. Lameness causes horses to be not just aversive during riding, but they actually form anticipatory pain-based responses and do it during tacking up. They say, hey, I know you're putting that saddle on. It's not that the saddle hurts. It's that I know you're about to do something that's uncomfortable. And the only language I have is to stamp my feet, flick my tail, pin my ears back, or threaten to bite you. But it's not actually a pain-based response. It's an anticipatory pain-based response. So yeah, when you see that behavior, think pain, of which gastric ulcers is one of the potential causes.
So in terms of diagnostics here, is there a very clear path? So this is one of the questions that I kind of put out to my Facebook group, Bit Spurs and Good Sense. Would y'all have any questions? One of the questions was, and we haven't gotten really specifically to omeprazole yet, but it's in the US at least, it's often more expensive to diagnose a horse with ulcers than it is to treat ulcers. So sometimes if you know the vet real well, you're just like, hey, let's do a month of treatment. And if he gets better, it was ulcers rather than scoping him. So what do you think about that? Is that a total waste of money, reasonably appropriate, or what?
I think those conversations, as long as the conversation's involving the veterinarian, there's different paths that you can take. I think the critical element is if we do something like put the horse on omeprazole, something should change. And the reverse is we diagnose these horses with gastric disease, we treat them, and nothing changes. The horse doesn't change. And my question would be, well, is that gastric disease the horse's primary problem, or is it something like a musculoskeletal disease, a lameness, or a saddle fit issue, or a bit issue that's actually causing the horse's primary presentation, which is the aversive behavior, and the gastric disease is either a secondary outcome or an incidental finding. And so in terms of treatment trials, can we try treatment trials? Absolutely, because the thing is, if the horse responds to omeprazole, it's ulcers. Because it's the only thing omeprazole does is remove acid from the horse's stomach, and so it's gastric ulcers. Whether it's squamous or glandular depends probably a lot on what you're talking about in terms of the horse type and other things that are going on. We would expect to see something fairly quickly when we do that. A squamous tends to respond fairly rapidly, but glandular we would expect 1 or 2 weeks. But I think it's also looking at that, even if the horse responds, going back to saying, let's make sure we check those other things as well. So when we think about pain, instead of thinking about pain as a singular entity, pain can be cumulative too. So if we think about the human analogy, we might have a really bad hip and we need a hip replacement. And once we get the hip replacement, we're fine. Or we might have a slightly dodgy hip, a slightly dodgy knee, and a slightly dodgy shoulder. And any one of those 3 would be fine, but you put all 3 of them together and we cross a threshold of our ability to compensate for them and manage them, and it affects our quality of life. So if we think about our sports horses, and we know that our sports horses, 50 to 70% of them have gastric disease. We know that sports horses, 50 to 70% of them have low-grade orthopedic disease. Then you add in dentistry and bits and stuff like that. It's stepping back and saying, let's look at the whole horse, and let's not just get we might need to treat more than one component to get this horse back to where we need it to be. And we might need to address the behavioral impact of a learnt anticipatory pain-based behavior. Once we take the disease away, we still need to potentially retrain that horse back to where we want it to be. We can't just assume because we made the problem go away that the horse has forgotten about it. So yes, you can do that, but do it with an open mind.
So you have done a good bit of research specifically on omeprazole, what it does do, what it doesn't do, and so forth. So is this our big gun in treatment here? Is it just a part of the picture and the husbandry side of it? What are your honest thoughts on omeprazole here? Is this a miracle cure or not really?
Well, it's not a silver bullet, and it's not going to cure something permanently if we don't change the underlying reasons why it occurred in the first place. So, omeprazole remains our cornerstone, in my opinion, remains our cornerstone drug for management of most of our gastric disease. The way it works is very simple. It just stops acid production. And so it doesn't actually heal the stomach. It just creates an environment where the stomach can heal itself. And the efficacy of that varies between, it's more effective for squamous disease than it is for glandular disease. So that's why we pair it up with other things when we treat glandular disease. But treatment is only as good as what you're changing in the background. And so from a squamous disease point of view, treating a horse that developed ulcers because of its environment and not changing its environment, what's going to happen? You stop treating, the ulcer's going to come back. And we know that. They come back within days, and certainly by a month, they're basically back to baseline. So to me, treatment for squamous disease or treatment for both of them really, it's a circuit breaker. And we should look at treatment as a circuit breaker while we look at the background of addressing the drivers of disease that are there in the first place. And we think about it as that continuum rather than I've treated the horse, it's fixed. It's not like an infection with antibiotics. So if you've got an infection, you take antibiotics, the antibiotics work, the infection's gone, you're fine. No problems. Treatment is only as good as the changes you make in the background to stop the disease from reoccurring. Because if you don't make those changes, it's coming back.
Are there any unexpected symptoms of ulcers that you see that the layman might not pick up on, that, oh, that might be this horse telling me we could have this problem?
When we talk about the sort of the symptoms, we talk about, there's a lot of them described, a lot of different ones described. The ones that we see consistently are things that happen, common at a population level. I think the key thing is when we're looking at an individual horse, it's change. It's something that changes in that horse that the horse person who knows their horse can pick up on. And so an analogy would be, we know that the single best predictor of respiratory disease in the horse is owner-reported clinical signs. So for all of our ability to listen to horses and do all these tests, the actual best predictor is the owner saying it either coughs or it's slow to recover from exercise. And that's the single best predictor. And then we go to, find out, understand the why. And I would say the same for gastric disease. It's the change in that horse that's the thing that I really look for. But I would emphasize that idea that traditional view of the horse can't have ulcers because it's in good body condition and looks great is not true. That's fundamentally not true for glandular gastric disease. It's much more typical of squamous disease to have that change in condition. But we still see plenty of good-looking horses that are well conditioned and in good condition with squamous disease as well. So these are generalizations, and it's that individual change that the horse person should be looking for.
You brought up the respiratory disease, and this is kind of an offshoot of what we've been talking about. But and again, I don't know worldwide if this is whatever, but at least in my part of the world, in the last 10 or 15 years, the number of horses with COPD that I have come across has just exploded. I mean, like, it used to be something I hardly knew of a horse that had it, and now I know dozens of horses that have it, and that seems, I don't know what has changed in the last 10 or 15 years, but and there are a number of diseases, like insulin resistance. There seems to be just an explosion of problems that didn't really exist or were pretty rare when I was new in the business, that now are much more common. So do you have any insight what might be going on there?
I think it's going to be multifactorial. I think a major driver is that our horses are tending to live longer. They're tending to be competitive longer than probably they were traditionally. And so, we see a lot more of the middle-aged riding horse ridden by the middle-aged rider than probably what we used to see, which was a lot more pressure on them and a lot more churn and burn. And that's probably good for the horses overall, that they get to live longer lives and longer low-key lives and tick along. So I think some of it's a population effect. I think then on top of that, we have the implications of modern management, and it's the same in the gastric ulcer world. I would say, we've known a lot about a lot of risk factors for gastric disease for 25 years, but I'm not sure we've made that much impact. In fact, we had a study presented at a big research symposium recently, and the numbers being reported for squamous disease were the same as what was reported 25 years ago, because it's management associated. And so when we think about insulin dysregulation, it's a pure management disease. Where some of it's breed. There's a breed predisposition, an individual predisposition, but it's being induced in these horses by, we're killing them with kindness. And I'd say that the COPD is the same, as this perception that a horse living in a stable is its best life. I would counter that a golden prison is still a prison. And that goes back to that friends, forage, and freedom. And so I think we're seeing that intersection of older horses that have been able to be kept alive longer because they're still healthy, intersecting with the implications of our management systems, which are driving respiratory and endocrine disease.
Do you think there is anything to the diagnostics changing over the years? Like you were talking about when you started out at this clinic, there was maybe one privately owned gastroscope in all of Australia, and now, a lot more vets would have access to more specialized equipment, and thus maybe they're diagnosing things that would have been missed 20 years ago. Do you think that's a factor at all?
I think, certainly things like insulin dysregulation, when I graduated, we were taught that laminitis was the disease and you treated laminitis. Now we teach that laminitis is an outcome of a disease and go looking for the underlying reason. And so, in that 25-year space, we didn't talk about, insulin dysregulation didn't exist when I graduated. It was a non-existent disease in the horse. And so there's definitely, but COPD, recurrent airway obstruction or HEAVS, whatever you want to call it, it's been around since the day is long. So I think some of it is increased awareness and we see more of it. But I think if we look at the data, what limited data we have following populations over time, the disease has always been there. It's just whether we're looking for it. And obviously at an individual level, for the individual horse owner, it's probably more visible because there's more diagnostics. But from the horse perspective, it's probably those other factors that are also driving it.
So specifically with regard to the ulcer picture here, are there any genetic components, certain groups of horses that are more predisposed or anything like that, or not really?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have some data. So for squamous disease, there's some data that different breeds are more predisposed, say, for example, thoroughbreds. The question, I think, is separating that out from the management and the type of the horse, and what they're doing for a job. So I think of squamous disease, as I said, primarily 80% environment. There's 20% horse. And what I think that horse component is the behavioral component. It's that a lot of that to do around eating behavior, and the horses, the horses sort of grazing behavior and stuff like that. And so that varies, from horse type to horse type. If you take a cold-blooded breed, they're going to eat anything that's put in front of them at any time. You take some of our warm-blooded breeds, they're much fussier, I think, and to some degree, I think we've trained them to be fussy. They've been trained to eat only the best, to their own detriment to some degree, because they won't eat that stalky, horrible looking hay that is below them. So that's one aspect. For glandular disease, we do have some data that suggests that there is a breed predisposition, so that we have data that shows that warm bloods are at increased risk compared to other breeds. We don't have a good data set of all the breeds in the US. That was a fairly direct comparison between warm bloods and other cold-blooded type horses. So the two kind of extremes. But I do think that the warm blood sport horse is the predisposed horse. The question is, how much of that is a true genetic predisposition, as in it's the genetics driving the disease risk, versus the behavioral implications of the horse's breed being a stress-related. We know warm bloods are a lot more sensitive and reactive to stimuli versus, for example, the cold-blooded breeds. So we haven't filtered that out yet. That's one of the sort of the unknown questions. But there's definitely breed disposition.
If you took that to an extreme, so like you're talking about thoroughbreds, so we have warm bloods, but then we have hot bloods too. So Arabians, thoroughbreds, and that tends to come with a certain temperament, a certain sensitivity, all of those things. So does the needle continue to go, and a hot-blooded breeded horse would be more likely, or not necessarily, or the research simply doesn't exist to
The
support
research
that?
doesn't exist is the answer. I think when we look at squamous disease, the question I keep looping back to is eating behavior. Eating behavior, eating behavior, eating behavior. How does it influence eating behavior? Because I think that's going to be the ultimate driver of so we've got George, who is like a hippopotamus. George is 19. He's been our old schoolmaster, and he will eat anything you put in front of him. He's an off-the-track thoroughbred. And then we've got over the road, we've got another horse that's the same age, off-the-track thoroughbred, that's far fussier and far more sensitive to the world. I think it's that individual factor. And I think for glandular disease, it's the same. I think it's recognizing, it's hard because they do internalize a lot, but I think at least we know, we've got, again, George, I don't think George, he's our schoolmaster. I don't think George really cares who rides him, as long as he gets a pat and a scratch, and he actually, he likes doing his thing. You can put kids on him. He'll do, he's a schoolmaster. My daughter's got a horse that's called Molly May, Australian stock horse. It hates everyone but her. And so I think for that horse being ridden by someone else, even being handled by someone else, you can see it's behaviorally stressful for that horse. She just doesn't like it. She doesn't like anyone but my 15-year-old daughter. And so it's that individual level effect, I think, that's probably the dominant thing, and the personality and the nature of the horse as much as it is the breed per se.
So what about exterior factors that we haven't talked about? So like for instance, in humans, one of those, I think it won a Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine, the discovery of H. pylori, a bacteria that was actually more responsible for ulcers in humans than we thought. Is there any of that going on in a horse, or two different species, not the same thing at all?
Yeah, so that was a couple of Australians actually, who basically drank H. pylori to prove that they could infect themselves and give themselves ulcers, and they got a Nobel Prize out of it. So well done. In humans, as I said before, there's 20 odd different types of gastric ulcers. The dominant ones have been historically H. pylori and non-steroidal associated ulcers. So people taking ibuprofen, chronically taking ibuprofen, naproxen, whatever their non-steroidal of choice is for managing chronic orthopedic pain, And so they're the major drivers. But what's happening in human medicine is H. pylori is very much reflective of hygiene standards. And so as hygiene standards are lifting around the world, H. pylori is becoming a much less significant driver of gastric disease. And what they're seeing in humans is a much greater prevalence of what they call idiopathic peptic ulcer disease. And idiopathic is just the fancy word for we don't know what causes it. And they have the same frustration. They don't understand idiopathic peptic ulcer disease, but it's a stress-based disease. And so if you take that across to the horse, we know H. pylori is not involved. It's been looked at several times. No one's been able to show any association. Non-steroidals potentially have a role, but as general short courses, I don't overly worry. It's more if we're thinking about long duration that there's a potential for an engagement. But the vast majority of horses we see have no history of non-steroidals that's relevant, and we're effectively looking at the same idiopathic peptic ulcer disease, so which is a non-specific inflammatory gastritis as best as we know. So yes and no in terms of we're paralleling the human experience just from a different direction.
So in the veterinary world, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs we would typically use would be bute and banamine. So I've always heard like if we're going to give a horse bute, and usually we're using pace bute, you don't do that more than 3 days in a row, or you're risking giving the horse ulcers. I had a client that took it to LSU vet school, and she kept that horse on bute every day for like 6 weeks under their direction, which scared the hell out of me. But I also know, I mean, it wasn't Joe down the road that told her to do that, right? I mean, it was a vet school. But so twofold question: is that as strong a connection as we think it is, or is that kind of a wives' tale? And secondarily, if it is it only the paste version that we would give orally, or if we injected bute, would it run the same risk?
So the second answer is both. It's both. There are some topical effects of the paste in terms of direct toxicity, but it's both. It's a systemic effect primarily. The first one is it's a really individual level response. So the individual susceptibility to side effects associated with non-steroidals is highly variable. So, you know, we've got old ponies that have lived on a gram of bute for years of their life and tolerated it just fine. And we've got other horses that get short durations and appear to have issues associated with that, whether it be gastric or whether it be hindguts, probably more of a concern, often particularly with phenylbutazone. So I think it comes down to those conversations with your veterinarian and knowing your own horse's history. I personally am at the relatively not worried end of the scale. I think as long as we're using the drugs appropriately within their licensed therapeutic doses, I'm reasonably comfortable giving it as needed, as much as necessary and as little as possible. I think we need to recognize that we're talking about pain, and particularly if we're talking about chronic pain, just because we stop caring about it doesn't mean it goes away. And we know that from humans. We know that chronic pain, one of the biggest challenges of chronic pain is everyone else stops caring, but if you've got chronic pain, you still care. Everyone else is like, oh, you've had this for 6 months, you should be over it by now. And like, no, it still hurts. And I think there's those welfare implications. So I think we've got to be careful of not being so scared of what might happen that we stop doing something that is actually good. We just need to recognize what risks are involved and monitor appropriately and intervene when necessary. But I don't think we should stop doing something that's inherently beneficial just because we're scared of something that might happen.
Completely agree. And in fact, this is actually this is where you get to decide whether you want to join me in this end of the pool or if we edit this part out. But I actually see a downside to the welfare debate that is going on with horses. I think part of what's going on is we're getting less stomach for some of this stuff, and that's really more on us than it is on the horse. So for instance, one of the things that I'm starting to see is this term we used to have of serviceably sound for some of these older horses. It's going away, and now there are plenty of people that say, well, no, you can't ride that horse, it has a problem. And one thing I have clearly seen in the world is that when a horse loses its economic value, its life gets worse. And so to me, I'm 47. I've I've had lots and lots and lots of various wrecks in my life. I don't think I would pass a vet check, but I'm still happy to get out of bed and go to work in the morning. And I hope I have another 20 or 30 years of starting horses and all that stuff in me. And I wouldn't want to be put out to pasture just because sometimes my knee hurts or whatever. And so you handle that however you want. Like we now have rules where you can't show this horse at this competition with a gram of bute in him. And I see a point to that. Like there are definitely some horses that we would be pushing in a way that we shouldn't, but there's also horses that are a little arthritic or whatever. And just like I might take a couple Advil in the morning, you know, that it would be a perfectly ethical thing to do to me. And so I kind of think this is one of the situations where we throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there should be some discretion, some judgment allowed here, that just because I've buted this horse for this show, I'm not doing something immoral, unethical, and shouldn't be allowed to compete. It was actually an appropriate decision for this horse in this case, and so forth. So I'm gonna throw that hot potato to you, and you handle it any way you want. If you want me to just edit this out, I'm good with that too. So
No, I think it's a very relevant discussion. I think at the very high level, there's two elements to the conversation. One is, well, three probably. One is what we do and why we do it. And the other is our ability to explain that to external facing audiences. Because I think when we think about the concept of social license, and at the spearhead of this is obviously racing. Thoroughbred racing is the spearhead of this because it's the most visible of our sports, but we also see it with the Olympics, with the dressage and blue tongues. We saw it with the whips 4 years ago or 5 years ago, with the pentathlon. It's this concept of social license. So it's what we do and our ability to explain why we do it. And we do it because argument doesn't fly. It doesn't fly. And so when we have conversations around the use of whips, spurs, take your pick, we need to be able to justify why we're doing that in a logical, coherent manner. I think there's also the concept of, I agree with this idea of absolutism. I think absolutism in any facet of the world is inherently dangerous. I think we take anything to an extreme, we're going to end up in a bad space.
it's absolutely wrong. Yes, sir.
Yeah, absolutism is just not a recipe for a good, productive life. I think when we talk about the welfare argument, I think what we're looking at is, I like the FEI's position. So the FEI's position is a good life for horses. And then World Horse Welfare is the other big voice in this conversation that I sort of tend to follow. World Horse Welfare are somewhat unique in the horse welfare advocacy space because they're really the only one with primarily a utilitarian approach to welfare. So rather than saying we can't do it, their concept is a net good life. And so you put the FEI principle of a good life together, you put the World Horse Welfare definition, and it's this concept of a net good life. And that's an acceptance that we will, in our management of a domesticated species, in this case horses, impose things upon them that at the time have potentially negative effects, but the overarching goal is a net good life. And so I would take your example of the aged horse as being a really good one, is that, we've got George out in the paddock. He's 19. Our goal is to provide him with a net good quality of life. When we warm him up, he's a little bit stiff. Okay, that's a sign. We say stiff because it's a nice way of saying that he's not in pain. It's the same, right? But the same thing is, 5 minutes later, we put George in front of a show jump and his ears go forward and he's like, baby, let's rock and roll. And you put him on a cross country course and he's 10 foot tall and bulletproof, and he really enjoys doing the work that he does. And so we have to balance that in an aged horse and say, is what we ask him, that level of discomfort he experiences during warm up balanced by the joy that he experiences during competition? And I think personally, as long as we're achieving that net good life, we're headed in the right direction. But we need to be able to communicate that. And I think critically, we as horse people inherently believe that the horses enjoy doing what they're doing. And, I ride my horse that likes cows. They love cows. They get down and they go, hey, come on, we're going to play. They do it in the paddock by themselves. They play games. My PoloCross horses play PoloCross in the paddock by themselves. They do all the ducking and weaving. I look at, some of our horses that love jumping, and they love jumping. Like they're like little kids jumping up and down on the spot. I want to jump. I want to jump. But we have to be able to communicate that. We have to be able to show that to the broader audience, that we're not just using these horses, that we're collaborating with these horses for a net good life. And I think that's the biggest goal, because we don't have very effective tools for doing that. Equally, I think we have to be willing to challenge a lot of what we do as not okay. And I think there are a lot of practices that are done for traditional reasons that if we were to sit there and critically evaluate them from outside, they're probably not okay. And they're not contributing. They're either an unnecessary negative imposition, or they're not balanced by a suitable positive, net quality life. And you can pick a discipline, and you can have that conversation in any discipline, and that's very dangerous territory. But I think I would take dressage as an example. I think if we look at my favorite horse at the Olympics was a horse called, what was his name? It was a British horse. I've forgotten his name now. But anyway, he came out. He was the one that came in as the emergency, and they were never meant to be there. And they came out. Becky was the lady that rode him, was her name, and they came out, and this horse was just like, yay! I'm having so much fun. It was like, it was having a ball. It had a crowd. It was playing up to the crowd, and it got 55%. The next horse came out, was cranked down, tight, facial ears, got 77% because it was more technically correct. That's where I think we've got to start that conversation. We've got to say, and that's picking on one discipline, but I think we've got to ask those questions across all of our disciplines and be willing to say stuff that we did 5, 10, or 20 years ago is not okay anymore, but we can find a balance for it. And then the conversation around medication is part of that conversation. But we've got to be able to communicate to people why we're doing that, how we're doing that responsibly, because the challenge with medications is that there's that immediate perception of, well, you're forcing a horse to do something it doesn't want to do. But also, we know, unfortunately, there is a sub-element of all of our disciplines that the moment you give them an inch, they'll take a mile when it comes to medication control. And so sometimes it's easier just to say no than to say, well, yeah, but.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember that horse's name. I love that horse. He was so cool. He was having a ball.
Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about, and I'm totally on board with you that like if I'm looking for pictures to do a presentation on dysfunction of bits, I add the word dressage in my search, because that's where you're going to find the most of it. And that's also one of the audiences that is the least receptive to any of the changes that might be suggested. But there are certainly other examples. Just to play devil's advocate here a little bit, I come at everything from more the behaviorist perspective, and I feel like there is a real need now on this kind of social engagement thing to play the devil's advocate here. I throw veterinarians under the bus all the time, because people kind of talk about pain in horses, and I say, well, would you think of veterinarians as being cruel? Because nobody causes more pain to horses than veterinarians do. Everything, if they're drawing blood, they're poking them with needles, that's all that they do. And so I think even in the behavioral context, like I've spent a large chunk of my career working with problem horses, and sometimes they need an ugly few days to start looking for a better way, and where we can get them out of a bad frame of mind and into a deal. And so while I don't think it needs to be the first tool in the toolbox or a tool that everybody uses, I do think it's a tool that can be used appropriately in the right circumstances and will ultimately have that positive net effect on that horse's life. And so again, that's part of the welfare conversation that concerns me, because I know there have been some horses that I have messed with that I had to get pretty nasty with, but I wasn't doing it from a place of my ego or anything like that. I was doing it for their benefit, and they came out on the other side of it and were then able to function in the horse world again, and they were going to be euthanized otherwise. And so to me, the trade of 3 bad days versus euthanization, I think we have that net positive effect. But I don't think that's a conversation people are comfortable having these
Well,
days.
I think it's that critical net positive effect and willingness to challenge. Okay, just because I did it last time, is it what I do this time? And so the rear end bit example I used before, I think is a good thing. Do I use a rear end bit? Absolutely. Will I use a rear end bit to manage a horse that I've got 10 minutes to get a job done with because I need to get that job done to get a blood sample for net benefit to make a diagnosis on that horse so I can move on to the next one? Absolutely. Um, it's asking the question at the time rather than that reflex, I'm doing it because. And so, I think veterinarians are put in a uniquely challenging position, which they're held up against people who retrain horses and said, well, you can't do that. And it's like, well, you don't have 10 minutes to fix this horse. And actually, I've been to shows where I've seen horsemen be given that horse and they've got to produce that horse in 30 minutes or they've got to produce that horse in 2 days. And their methodology is subtle, but it is a lot more, let's call it direct, than if you gave them 2 weeks with that horse. And there are some people who can just have that exceptional talent, but if you actually, my experience is watching when you shorten the time frame, the intensity goes up and the need for intensity to get result goes up. And the vet's given a horse often they've never seen, never handled, and they're told to do something that the horse doesn't necessarily like in a short time of frame. And so it is getting the job done for net positive benefit. I know I've got colleagues who work in a big horse sanctuary in the UK, and they do not twitch horses. But they have a team of behavioralists that if they have a horse that needs nasogastric tubing, for example, and won't tolerate it, they have a team of behavioralists who'll come in and spend hours with that horse to get it to accept the procedure. That's not the reality of the average veterinarian's life. And it's not the reality if you told that behavioralist you've got 15 minutes to get this done, it's not going to happen. And so it's the pragmatism and utilitarianism of it that I think is important to recognize. What I would say is there are very few, and hopefully very, very, very few vets whose intention is to cause net harm. They are trying to cause net good. It's just how you get there, using your analogy as well. How you get there can vary.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to implicate that when I'm throwing vets under the bus. I'm trying to use them as, of course, they don't have that intention, and yet if you look at it realistically, they really do nothing but cause pain. I also look at this as in with some of these things you mentioned, spurs or whatnot. The same horse will not feel pain the same way minute to minute. So in other words, in a trauma situation, I have seen vets be able to get right in there before any kind of lidocaine or sedation or anything like that and touch cuts and things that I would never think you could touch without that horse flipping over. And the reality is they have adrenaline and cortisol going through their system and they really don't feel you doing this right now. And that can be exactly the same if we're in like PoloCross. That horse is going to be amped up. They're going to have adrenaline coursing through. And so the thing they would feel subtly at a walk earlier, they will not feel in the heat of the moment. You have to essentially get louder to cut through all of that stuff. So they now turn right. And it's not because they're being a turd or something like that. It is simply because when you're in that sympathetic nervous system and you have all that stress and everything on you, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, you just lose like fine motor skill control. There is a whole series of physiological things that happen that simply mean the picture now looks like this, where it would look like that in a different circumstance. So that's something I think that the general public, you're talking about watching the Olympics or whatever, they don't understand that. And if you understand that, I do think it changes the picture a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is in an environment where people are time poor, there's this desire for the push button outcome, and it's missing the sheer number of hours and wet saddle blankets that go into this training under appropriate conditions. And I remember fairly early on when I started as an adult rider and my horse was misbehaving and I got into it, and someone came up and said, "Not here, not now." And this was probably 15 years ago. It's like, "Not here, not now." A, it's public, don't do it. B, this is not where your horse learns. You need to go home and fix that problem at home so that when you get here, it's second nature. And that was, at the time, no one likes being told what to do. It's like, but actually that was really sound advice and I think, when we think about wanting to be weekend warriors and stuff like that, we not here, not now. There was something went around Facebook the other day about someone at one of the big equestrian centers coming off the show ring because his horse had refused twice and laying into it. And it's like, not here, not now. If the horse is failing in the competition, you haven't put the work in at home. And it's really, I think the challenge of the democratization of horses, it's got a lot of benefits to it, but you still got to put the time in. And that's one of the things I, struggle with. I'm busy. My daughter rides my horse most of the time during the week if I want to compete him, but then I just accept if he doesn't do what I want him to do, that's not his fault, it's mine. If he won't pick up the right lead on the 10-meter circle, well, that's my fault because I haven't spent the time. I can't punish him for it.
You have not only taught, not only been a speaker, but you have actually practiced veterinary medicine in 3 different continents that I'm aware of. So how does that, like, I know here in the US, in addition to having a medical license, you also have to have a license with the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, in order to be able to write prescriptions and so forth for these drugs. So what does that picture look like for you? Is that a challenge, or you kind of, if you travel, you're doing this under the auspices of Dr. So-and-so and that allows you the privileges, or what?
Yeah, so it varies where you are. So when I worked in the US, for example, we were able to practice under a hospital license. And so we were hospital based. We didn't travel on the road at all. And we were effectively operating under the license of the director of the hospital. That's the way the legislation worked in Virginia. Most other jurisdictions, you need to be licensed as a veterinarian in that jurisdiction. So in Finland, I was licensed as a veterinarian with the local authorities. In Australia and New Zealand, if I go and work, I'm licensed as a veterinarian. And so it's a challenge. I do a lot of consultancy, and it's always, the moment it involves anything medical, the moment it involves any administration of a drug, it's like your veterinarian needs to be leading this conversation, and I'm providing advice to your veterinarian, but they're the one making the primary decisions. So, if someone sends me a message and says, "What should I treat my horse with?" I said, "You need to go talk to your veterinarian. If your veterinarian wants to talk to me, more than happy to provide some advice." But it's been really conscious. Obviously you would provide first aid to a horse that's suffering or in pain, but beyond that, it's been really conscious of there's regulatory involvement, but also it's professional respect. No one likes someone else wandering in and stepping on their toes, because the reality is you're never given the full story. You get given the version of the story that the person wants you to hear. And then it's amazing how often I've worked in referral practice for most of my career, vets from the field sending horses in, and you get one story and you go, "That seems a bit weird." And then you call up the referring vet and you say, "What's going on?" And they're like, and you go, "Well, that's an entirely different story from the one I got 15 minutes ago or 2 hours ago." So you learn to be sort of skeptical of those things, but you also, it's about respect. It's really trying to respect colleagues and peers, and we're allowed to have different opinions. But it's just, and if I disagree with someone, I will tell them, but that's between me and the other vet, and then it's still their case, and still they're the ones taking the legal responsibility for it.
I'll just say too that what you just described there of not getting the whole picture, that's not exclusive to veterinarians. Trainers face there. There are so many cases where 6 months later, I hear this other sentence come out of their mouth, like, "Oh, hold on, wait, that's not what you were telling me." Like that makes sense now. That was actually an important data point that you withheld there, or whatever. So,
Yeah, and some people like to fuel conflict, and so it's learning to not buy into it and just to step back and give the other person the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise, and take a clean slate, but not to be judging what others have been doing, because I think very rarely do we actually have the full set of information to operate on there.
And the last vet question I'll have for you in that regard is, I know here in the U.S. we have an impending major shortage of equine veterinarians that is 10 years out, 15 years out, something like that. But it's looming, which is exacerbated or harder to understand, given that we have also lost 40% of the horses in the U.S. So even though our horse numbers have plummeted, the number of vets to keep up with them is plummeting even faster. Is that a worldwide phenomenon? Are y'all also seeing that in Australia? And I don't know if you still have connections with Europe, or is that just here, or what?
It's worldwide. We're seeing a worldwide shortage of veterinarians across the board. And then we're seeing, particularly, it's probably equine or large animal practice in general. It's not just equine, but large animal practice in general is experiencing the same shortages. I think you're probably at the pointiest end of it in the US in terms of when you look at the numbers and you look at the speed at which it's happening. It's happening very, very fast in the US. And I think there's going to be some really significant challenges for the industry to reshape and manage coming out of that. And I think it's the same as we talked about, handling horses, and we can't just keep doing what we did 5 or 10 years ago because it's what we did. I think when we look at the equine industry from a veterinary perspective, the answer's the same. And that's two-way. The vets can't keep doing necessarily the way they've done business, but the owners also have to come and meet them in the middle. And we can't have those same expectations that we've necessarily always historically had, because the resource is just not there to support it anymore.
So I guess I lied. I have one more question on that. So we have also seen in our lifetimes, I guess we're about the same age, the rise of people kind of practicing some overlapping modalities, but they're outside of the veterinary field. So equine dentists, some of the various body workers, osteopathic stuff, and all of that. And that's legally murky here in the US. It depends on what state you're in, and there are a lot of ways. But like 30 years ago, every farrier I know had a bottle of Ace or Dormosudan or something in the toolbox of their truck. And if that's still the case, they would be very, very, very discreet about it, because the implications now are a lot more serious than they used to be. And I know vets on both sides of this. Like, I see vets that are open to the help, and now there are certain parts of their practice they don't spend much time on. Like, if we have dental issues, I'll handle maybe an extraction or something significant that requires surgery, but I'm okay with Tanya down the road doing 80% of that work and only referring to me the more serious surgical sides, or the same with some of the body work. I know some vets that are very territorial and protective about that, and they're hard line on, if you're not licensed, you have no business putting your hands on a horse and manipulating anything. So to me, that's one of the obvious things, kind of just doing the math, given the shortage that's coming and given that there's a rise in that. It's an inevitable conclusion that they're going to have to be included in this umbrella at some point and recognized, and the legalities have to be worked out where it can take effect. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you talk about prickly questions. That's probably the prickliest one so far. I think if you look at it, it's that sheer volume of work that you allude to, and it's that resource availability. And so in the last question I said, I don't think the vets can keep doing what they've been doing. That the model needs to change. Exactly how that changes is up for discussion. But I think this would be one area where that conversation needs to be had and worked through. And so effectively, what you're talking about is in a sense what we would say mid-level practitioners. And so nurse practitioners would be the human equivalent. So we have, because the human healthcare system has gone through very much the same problems, especially in remote areas. Like I don't know what it's like in the US, but in Australia, human healthcare in remote areas is a real challenge. And we're talking proper remote areas. And so the role for mid-level practitioners, in that case, nurse practitioners, has been something that's developed to fill that gap and meet those intermediary needs. I think that the challenge around that is the how, and it's that how do you find a middle ground? How do you find appropriate training, regulation, and supervision so that it's done in ultimately the best interests, in this case, of the horse. And so there's been that huge conversation in Colorado about mid-level practitioners, and that's opened a big can of worms about where the line is drawn. I think we need to cross that bridge in the horse world. What I will say is there are examples internationally of that being done. And so, for example, in the UK, their dentistry is performed by a combination of trained and certified lay people and by veterinarians working in collaboration. And there is a formal process by which lay people accredited for equine dentistry and then working with the veterinarians. And a really good example would that be if a horse requires sedation, that is a veterinary intervention, not a layperson intervention, and it requires that engagement. And so there are examples of it. Whether they fit into different particular models and stuff like that, but I don't think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result. So we can't keep doing what we've been doing. At either end of those spectrums, we need to find a way that works, that is ultimately appropriately regulated, because at the end of the day, it's that regulation that's there to protect the owner and the horse from outcomes.
Well said. Well said. And I would be the first to say we do not have, in most of these external modalities, we do not have unifying bodies. So you could be certified as an equine dentist by maybe any of a couple of dozen schools. So there isn't something like the AAEP, which is overarching all of it. So we live in interesting times, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's the same. We can't keep doing the same thing, because the industry is fundamentally changing. It's the what, I think, is pretty clear. It's the how that we've really got to work through.
So kind of talking about alternative medicine maybe would be a way to frame it. Within the ulcer world, there are now a multitude of what we might call herbal remedies. There are even feeds that are sold as having gastric guarding type elements involved in them. In your experience, is any of that worthwhile? Is there any research behind it, or is this kind of a let the buyer beware sort of a situation? And omeprazole is and then there's a I'm spacing on the sucralfate. Um, what are your thoughts? If we get outside of those two, are we wasting our time, or is there any research backed benefit there?
So I think it's thinking about treatment. When we think about pharmaceuticals, drugs, we're thinking about treatment, and we're thinking about that primarily being a circuit breaker for us addressing the underlying drivers of disease. And so most of my conversations are spent around prevention, because prevention is the cornerstone of what we're ultimately trying to achieve, prevention/management of disease. And so in an ideal world, we'd get to the place where the drugs aren't necessary. We know that's not going to happen, but we reduce the need for drugs down to a point where we can manage them with, particularly when we talk about squamous disease, 80% environment, 20% horse. And so that's the goal. in terms of, I would say, is absolutely buyer beware. Once you get into the feed and supplement space, some would call it an unregulated industry. I would call it a dysregulated industry. There are no controls on what anyone says, does, or claims within the supplement industry. Anyone can tell you anything, and no one will hold them to account. And so it is 100% buyer beware of in that space. And what I would also say is, for an industry, and I do work in the supplement industry, and I'll declare a conflict of interest, but we won't talk specifics. But what I will say is, there is enough science in the supplement industry that you don't need to choose fairy juice. There are a number of evidence-based supplements. There is enough evidence behind feed and feed ingredients and those types of things that we can make scientific, evidence-based decisions to expect positive outcomes. We don't need to grasp at straws. The need is not there. There is enough science that we can go to the science and say, okay, I'm looking for a supplement to do this, especially in the gastric space. It's interesting when you talk about supplements in general. The gastric space is probably the one where there has been the most scientific validation and work done. Once you move out of the gastric space, supplements, the scientific level drops down dramatically. But in the gastric space, there's a body of work that we can go to and say, there is science here that we can base our decisions on. We don't need to be taking the lollipop approach of suck and see. And looking for some magical solution. We can make good quality decisions based on a reasonable body of evidence.
So would the specific word herbal be a red flag for you, or is there some reasonable good to be done within that space if you are taking steps to educate yourself and find evidence-based products?
To my knowledge, there's very little evidence to support any particular herbal remedy for gastric ulcers.
One of the other things that has been starting to be talked about a lot more, and I don't know that there's a ton of research behind it at this time, but is age of weaning and some of the long-term ramifications of weaning too early. Within this complex picture, we're talking about personality types and environments, and do you see any correlation between, and maybe that isn't a data point that you ever get within all of this, maybe it is, I don't know, but is early weaning a potential contributing factor to a horse that will later be predisposed to ulcers?
I don't know is the answer. I don't know, and I don't think we know, but I certainly don't know.
Would you have any suspicion there, knowing what you know, that would be a place to investigate, or maybe not?
I'm sort of aware of the conversation at a fairly high level. One of the challenges when you become an expert, your world gets a lot smaller. I think it goes back to, particularly when we think about glandular disease, but also squamous diseases and eating behavior. What we want as horses that are healthy and happy. And it's that conversation, that distinction between welfare and well-being, absence of disease, but more than that, happiness and socially capable, in their, what is socially capable for a horse, the capacity to live in a herd with other animals, or at least with other individuals, all those sorts of things. And so anything that potentially deleteriously impacts on that has a potential to change the long term for that horse. So potentially in gastric ulcer world, yes. But I think you're starting to draw a fairly long string to the bow. Mm-hmm. But if we're producing horses that are just socially dysfunctional, mm-hmm. then that's not going to do anyone any good in any way, shape, or form.
I think there's a reasonable number of those out there. At least there are a lot of horses that don't know that they're a horse, and they don't know how to be a horse, and it changes the picture of everything involved at that point,
Yeah, it's really interesting. We do this work with these retired off the tracks thoroughbreds, and these horses typically will have spent, my guess is between 2 and 5 years. Well, it's not a guess, I know. They will have typically spent between 2 and 5 years operating in a stable environment, in a racing stable environment without turnout. They haven't been out socially engaging with other horses. And they're really interesting to bring home and put in a paddock with other horses. Most of them are generally well behaved in the sense that they're not taking on the other horses trying to kill them, but they'll often spend the first few days standing at the gate waiting for the person. And you walk down and they're standing there at the gate going, well, where's the person, where's the person, where's the person? But man, they're adaptable. Within 2 to 3 weeks, they're standing in the back of the paddock and they'll come up for food and they're still friendly and they're still sociable, but they're like, no, that's my new best friend there. That big brown thing, him and we're like this. And so I think I think they're incredibly adaptable when we give them those fundamental needs. It just loops back to friends, forage, and freedom. But I think that fundamental companionship for horses, they're incredibly adaptable to reverting back to that need.
On the treatment or prevention side of this, I mentioned some of the herbal stuff and the supplements earlier. I forgot to mention the prebiotic and probiotic aspects of that. So does that bucket hold any water as far as you're aware?
It's the same. It's kind of the same answer. In the role of prebiotics and probiotics in gastric health, not clear. There's some data to support. There's one study, for example, looked at a specific strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, brewer's yeast, and showed some benefits for squamous health. And so they probably do have some benefits, but it's not where the body of work has been done. The body of work with prebiotics and probiotics is largely in terms of hindgut health. And there is a clear body of work that shows that they can be very beneficial to hindgut health. And all of our competition horses live on a probiotic for their hindgut health. Whether they end up on a gastric supplement depends on the horse, but all of our horses live on a probiotic for hindgut health because it's good. It improves feed conversion, it improves nutrient utilization, but also Saccharomyces cerevisiae specifically is very good at modulating the impact of change. So when we put change into the horse's life, one of the things that happens is the microbiota in the hindgut start to change. They change dramatically. And what we see is when we use specific strains of yeast, we can modulate that. So instead of having these big swings in microbial population, we can get a much flatter effect where it's closer to this. And that's important because when we think about things like colic risk, colic change is the enemy of colic, right? So change is the enemy of the horse's hindgut, the enemy of fermentation. And when we look at risk factors for colic, the number one risk factor for colic is change. Now, that can be change in different ways, but it's change. And so, but the key is it's very strain specific. You can't just grab brewer's yeast off the shelf and feed it and expect the same result. And the analogy I would use is it's like going to buy a vehicle and it's like, okay, I want a car. It's like, okay, what do you want that car to do? I want to haul a gooseneck. Okay, you're going to need a pickup truck. I want to drive around town and be energy efficient. Okay, you might need an electric car. Not all Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the same. And so it's about choosing yeast strains that are specific and studied. But within those strains, there's a very good body of evidence that they're very good for hindgut health.
Okay, that's interesting. So you mentioned colic a minute ago, and I had a question here too. I don't know how you approach colic, and are you running out of time? Do I need to let you go here shortly?
Oh, that's all right. We can finish up.
Okay,
Yeah.
I just have a few more. I'm getting real close. So one of the things I would fully expect any veterinarian I've been around, if you call him out to look at a colicky horse, he's about to put a gallon of oil down that horse's gullet. And I have always thought, knowing that, all the microbial things that are happening down the line that are feeding this horse, that has got to just be like dropping a bomb in his gastrointestinal system. And so is that the sort of thing that we would maybe expect ulcers to be a risk factor, that to be a risk factor for ulcers, or expect them to be more likely down the line, or no correlation between ulcers and colic at all?
I mean, colic's so multifactorial. So when we say what causes colic, there's no singular cause of colic. I mean, change is the biggest risk factor. But we do have associations between the presence of ulcers and increased risk of colic. So I think they can be a contributory factor. It's not necessarily that they are always a contributory factor, but they can be a contributory factor. I think when you're talking about managing the colic, and this is another one of those things that's probably changed since I graduated years ago, was we were taught to go out, treat the colic, and go home. Now we're taught to go out, treat the colic, manage the acute crisis, and then ask the question why. And that's where we go back to looking for underlying reasons of potential causes to colic, of which gastric ulcers could be one. But the big thing that we start with typically is obviously going to be diet and nutrition as the primary drivers of colic risk. But yeah, so there's been so that what we do in that first 24, 48 hours to manage the colic is a press the reset button. And then it's asking the question, well, why did the horse get colic in the first place? Can we prevent that from recurring? And so it's a little bit like the insulin dysregulation discussion. Instead of just treating the problem in front of us, asking what's the underlying driver and look for long-term management strategies to reduce risk of recurrence.
And I guess this will be my final question for you in terms of modalities to diagnose. So we already talked about gastroscoping, and I don't know if you would, I guess I'll ask this specifically. So if you are treating a horse, is scoping them a step one kind of a thing, and I'm not prescribing you anything without doing that? Is that a necessity for diagnostics? Or like for instance, I know of veterinarians that do acupressure points to diagnose ulcers as well. So on diagnostics, how do you feel about that? What's your experience tell you?
Yeah, so we started a study on acupressure points. I had someone who wanted to do some research and master's research on that come to me and say, I scope a lot of horses, I do a lot of acupressure, and I can tell you which horse has got ulcers by the acupressure. And I'm like, cool, no one studied this. Let's go ahead and have a look at that. And I said, just while you're doing this, the next 50 horses or so, collect the data, and then we'll sit down and we'll have a look, and then that'll allow us to refine into a formal research plan. And they came back at 50 horses, and there was zero correlation between any of the points that they had perceived as being related to gastric disease and the presence or absence of gastric disease. And so that was the last I ever heard of that potential research student. They disappeared into the ether. I think we see it's a little bit like the girthiness thing. So if we actually look, there's not a lot of data on girthiness, but there was one cool study from UC Davis from a few years ago where they looked at, from memory, it was 36 horses, somewhere around that, 30 odd horses. And they looked at, and what they showed was in that population, they ended up diagnosing about a third of them with gastric disease, a third of them with musculoskeletal disease or saddle fit issues, and a third with various other things. So I would actually ask the question when we're talking, it goes back to that behavioral thing. Are we actually looking at gastric disease, or are we looking at variations and manifestation of pain? And those horses that are hyper responsive to trigger points, I would actually question whether what you're seeing is a response to ulcers or whether you're seeing a pain-based response. Because again, we know in humans, if you have one side of chronic pain, you become hyper aesthetic and reactive elsewhere as well. And that's kind of the question I would throw down there. So I don't think anyone's really, showing me any data that says I can do acupressure and I can highly accurately predict a horse with ulcers. Now, the reality is when 60 to 70% of them have ulcers, you're going to be right 60 to 70% of the time, whether you do anything or not, right? And so, and there's other things around as well. So for me, it really comes down to, I will consider therapeutic trials like we discussed before. I think there's situations where it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, and a therapeutic trial is an appropriate intervention. or gastroscopy. And I think gastroscopy has a really important role, particularly now as we recognize that some of that behavior can be driven by other things like orthopedic disease. Getting that confirmation that it's gastric disease, I think, is really important in getting to the answer of making the horse feel better faster as quick as possible. Then it allows us to distinguish squamous and glandular, which allows us to tailor our long-term prevention, because we're going to spend some money on drugs, but we're going to spend the rest of that horse's life managing the risk of disease. And so we want to know what the right things to do are. And so I think gastroscopy is more than just a, have you got ulcers or not? I think it sets us up for understanding that total position of the horse. What I will also say is, anytime I do gastroscopy on a horse, I also trot that horse up for lameness now. I would not just do gastroscopy on a horse anymore. I would do gastroscopy and lameness simultaneously every single time, because those two run in parallel so much.
I would say within my work with bits, the mouth is one of the more expressive places on the horse. And I do find at times that even though the horse is expressing pain and problems and anxiety in the mouth, it doesn't necessarily correlate to the bit. That could be the right stifle or saddle fit or some other sort of a thing that they're actually we see it expressed here, but it isn't, the problem isn't here. It is shown somewhere else. So
Scratch their tail and their nose wiggles.
yeah, I really find the more I learn about this, the whole system of the horse, the more diagnostics of pain and problems becomes a very, very complicated picture. There's just so many things it could be. It is never as straightforward as we might like, or seldom.
Stepping back from what we've been conditioned and told to do, which is blame one thing, ulcers, versus stepping back and actually looking at a bigger picture. I think that's a really important take home.
Well, Dr. Sykes, I don't really have any more questions for you. I really want to thank you for your time. I have enjoyed this conversation tremendously, and I've learned a lot through it. I really, I have a very different picture in my mind of what the world of ulcers looks like now than before this began. So I really appreciate your time and your candor and willingness to come on here and spend this much time talking with me. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. No, thanks for having me. It's been great to be able to work through it and pick out a few different little pieces out of it, because it's such a big area.
We'll see you next week for another episode of Adult Onset Horsemanship. I've been your host, Daniel Dauphin.